More than 4,000 years ago, something strange happened to the ancient world. Great kingdoms weakened, cities emptied, trade routes fell silent, and entire systems that once seemed permanent began to break apart. Around 2200 BC, it was as if civilization itself started to come undone. No single invasion explains it. No single disaster fully fits. Only drought, fear, collapse, and a mystery historians are still trying to understand. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, tonight we travel back to the moment the ancient world began to fall. Night lies over a landscape that should feel eternal. The river still moves through the dark as it has for generations, slipping past fields, storage yards, temple walls, and sleeping houses built from mud brick and reed. In the distance, beyond the reach of torchlight, the desert waits in silence. The stars remain where they have always been. The flood, the harvest, the counting of grain, the ordering of labor, the prayers spoken at dawn and dusk. All of it seems part of a system older than memory and solid enough to outlast any living person. And yet, somewhere in that silence, something has already begun to go wrong. At first there is no dramatic moment to mark it. No single day when messengers arrive breathless with the news that the ancient world is falling apart. No crack opens across the earth large enough for everyone to see. The change begins more quietly than that, in ways easy to dismiss if a person sees only one village, one season, one ruler's reign. A canal runs lower than expected. A caravan arrives late. A storehouse official notices that the numbers on his clay tablets no longer match the confidence of older years. In one region, the pasture does not recover. In another, the flood comes weakly. Somewhere else, a road becomes less safe, and the men sent to guard it ask for more rations than the state can easily spare. Nothing yet looks like the end of an age. It looks, instead, like inconvenience, like bad luck, like a problem for next year. But 2200 BC stands close to one of the great turning points in human history, a threshold where several of the most impressive early civilizations on Earth begin to weaken, fracture, or transform at nearly the same broad moment. In Egypt, the radiant confidence of the Old Kingdom fades toward disorder. In Mesopotamia, the imperial strength of Akkad trembles and then breaks. Across neighboring regions, cities contract, trade shifts, populations move, and landscapes once dense with organized life begin to show strain. Scholars still debate the exact timing from place to place, and no single explanation fully accounts for this wide arc of instability. But what survives in the record suggests a pattern so large that it continues to unsettle modern historians, archaeologists, and climate scientists alike. Entire systems that seem deeply rooted begin to fail within the span of a few generations. That is part of what makes this ancient collapse so haunting. These are not primitive experiments at the edge of human possibility. They are already mature worlds. They build monuments on a scale that still commands awe. They manage labor, collect taxes, direct irrigation, regulate trade, and preserve royal memory in stone and inscription. They know how to feed cities. They know how to command armies. They know how to persuade people that order is natural and hierarchy inevitable. They are not weak because they are simple. They are vulnerable because they are complex. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. To understand why the collapse of the ancient world around 2200 BC feels so strange, it helps to stand for a while inside the world just before it breaks. For long stretches of the 3rd millennium BC, parts of the Near East and Northeast Africa are witnessing one of the most remarkable developments in the human past, the concentration of people, power, food, belief, and record-keeping into forms that look unmistakably like civilization in the fullest early sense. Villages have grown into towns, and towns into cities. Temples and palaces rise not simply as buildings but as machines for organizing human effort. Farmers work fields whose yields feed not only their own families but laborers, priests, officials, and craftsmen. Boats and caravans carry wood, metals, stone, textiles, oils, and grain across long distances. Scribes track debts and deliveries on clay and papyrus. Kings present themselves not merely as strong men but as guarantors of cosmic balance. There is something almost hypnotic about this confidence. In Egypt, the Nile seems to offer a reliable rhythm around which an entire civilization can tune itself. The flood recedes, rich soil remains, seed is cast, and the fields answer back. Monumental tombs and pyramid complexes rise from that confidence, as though stone itself has been recruited into the promise of continuity. In Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates, the world is less predictable and often harsher, but all the more impressive for what people have forced it to yield. Irrigation channels carve possibility into difficult ground. City-states compete, imitate, and absorb one another. Rulers extend their authority outward, binding different landscapes to a single political will. The evidence remains incomplete, and each region follows its own history, but together they reveal a human ambition that is no longer local or temporary. These societies do not think in terms of survival alone. They think in terms of permanence, and permanence leaves traces that can still be touched. Clay tablets baked by accident in palace fires, seal impressions stamped by administrators whose names are forgotten, foundation deposits hidden beneath walls, grain bins, workmen's settlements, quarries, harbours, and cemeteries. A fragment of inscription boasting of conquest, a skeleton bearing signs of malnutrition, a channel silted up, a layer of wind-blown dust where a busy street once ran. This strange intimacy of archaeology lies in this collision between scale and detail. A civilization falls, and what remains may be a few beads in the dirt, a broken jar, a collapsed doorway, a letter never delivered. The story of world-changing instability is often reconstructed from debris small enough to fit in a hand. That, too, is why the mystery persists. Ancient collapse is never neat. Civilizations do not vanish in the theatrical way popular imagination prefers. People do not simply disappear into empty air, leaving whole cities set like untouched stage scenery. What happens instead is slower, messier, and often more disturbing. Institutions weaken before settlements empty. Trade networks fray before writing habits change. One district may suffer while another adapts. A capital may decline while a smaller town survives. Elites continue speaking in the language of order long after the material foundations of order have begun to fail. By the time later generations look back, the process can seem almost invisible, because the world has not ended all at once. It has become harder to hold together. Imagine the view from a high place in one of these early states in the years before the crisis fully deepens. Smoke rises from hearths at dawn. Men and women move toward fields, workshops, or storehouses. Donkeys are loaded. Officials review deliveries. Priests prepare rituals. Children follow routines learned from parents who learned them from theirs. The system still functions well enough to appear normal, yet normality can be deceptive. A stable civilization is not a solid block. It is a negotiation with river, soil, labour, belief, weather, distance, and force. It is an agreement renewed season by season. Remove enough rain, or weaken enough authority, or strain enough farmland, and the structure does not collapse because one wall gives way. It collapses because too many quiet supports begin failing at once. One of the lesser-known details of this period is how much of early civilization rests not only on abundance, but on timing. Grain must arrive when labourers need feeding. Water must appear when sowing depends on it. Transport must remain predictable enough for rulers to plan taxation and redistribution. Even modest disruptions, repeated over years, can become catastrophic in societies that have grown used to coordinating thousands of people across broad territories. A modern observer may see stone monuments and assume these worlds are immovable, but monuments can survive precisely because they are less fragile than the human systems that built them. The pyramid remains, the bureaucracy that fed its builders may not. The walls stand, the confidence behind them thins. And so 2200 BC draws attention not simply because cities suffer or dynasties change, but because several regions that have achieved striking sophistication begin to encounter the same ancient truth. At nearly the same time, complexity does not guarantee resilience. In some places, the trigger appears environmental, in others, political. In others, both seem tangled together so tightly that separating them becomes impossible. Scholars still debate how synchronous these collapses truly are, and caution is necessary because different societies follow different timelines, and the archaeological record is uneven. But no serious reading of the evidence leaves the old confidence intact. Something large is happening across this world. Rain belts shift. River behaviour changes. Imperial systems overreach. Local stresses accumulate. People move. Governments fail to respond or respond too late. The old map of power grows unstable. For the people living through it, there is no grand historical label. No one says they are entering the crisis of the late third millennium. They know only the immediate texture of unease. The field is poor, the ration is smaller, the official is harsher, the road is dangerous, the neighbour has left, the letter does not come, the god has not answered in the expected way. Somewhere a ruler commissions inscriptions celebrating triumph even as his authority narrows. Somewhere a village elder tries to remember whether the sky has ever behaved like this before. Somewhere a child is born into a world that still contains temples, walls, canals, and kings, but not the certainty that once gave them meaning. That is where this story begins, not in ruins, but in confidence so complete that its undoing feels almost impossible. The ancient world around 2200 BC is not waiting to collapse because it is weak, backward, or exhausted. It is alive with labour, ambition, ritual, and memory. It has every reason to believe in itself, and that is what gives the coming fracture its peculiar weight. When such worlds fail, they do not merely lose wealth or territory. They lose the assumption that the future will resemble the past. Soon the storehouses will matter more than the monuments. The weather will matter more than royal titles. Roads, canals, and grain accounts will reveal more than victory inscriptions. The story will move through crowded cities and dry fields, through palace archives and empty settlements, through mud brick walls baked under a harder sky. It will pass from apparent stability into stress, from stress into fracture, and from fracture into the long human work of survival. But for now the lamps still burn, the scribes still write, the rivers still seem generous enough, and the ancient world, poised on the edge of one of its darkest transformations, continues as if dawn will always arrive in the old familiar way. In the centuries before the crisis sharpens into something unmistakable, the ancient world becomes increasingly skilled at turning landscape into order. This is one of the quiet marvels of early civilization. What later generations inherit as ruins and museum fragments is, in its own time, a living arrangement between soil, water, labour, and authority. A city does not rise merely because people gather in one place. It rises because grain can be made to arrive in quantities large enough to feed those who do not farm, because someone can store it, count it, protect it, redistribute it, and persuade everyone involved that this arrangement is legitimate. Behind every temple platform and palace courtyard lies an immense choreography of mud, seed, sunlight, and timing. The fields are the beginning of almost everything. Across Egypt, the Nile lays down its dark silt after the flood, renewing a narrow ribbon of fertility along the river banks and across the basin lands. In southern Mesopotamia, the achievement is less forgiving and in some ways more precarious. Here agriculture depends heavily on irrigation systems that must be dug, maintained, extended, and defended, channels, embankments, feeder canals, and drainage works become part of the architecture of civilization itself. Water is guided, delayed, divided, and made to serve political as well as agricultural ends. To farm successfully in such a world is not simply to plant and wait. It is to participate in a large communal mechanism whose parts include labour gangs, supervisors, storehouses, scribes, local officials, and distant rulers. This system allows populations to grow beyond the scale of earlier village life. People cluster more densely. Settlements become layered with specialized work: potters, metalworkers, weavers, brewers, merchants, priests, transporters, builders, and administrators all depend, directly or indirectly, on surplus food. The city is not an escape from the countryside. It is the countryside reorganized around concentration and control. A farmer's grain may feed a work crew hauling stone, a scribe recording rations, a temple singer, a soldier at a frontier outpost, or a craft specialist shaping a seal for an official who will never touch a plough. The distance between field and throne can be long, but it is built out of countless visible links. Barley and wheat move upward through the system, while orders, obligations, and ideology move back down. There is a peculiar beauty to these early economies when they are working well. Boats slide downriver with cargoes of grain, flax, timber, and ceramics. Donkeys pick their way along packed routes connecting towns to larger centres. Courtyards fill with measured sacks and jars. Officials sit cross-legged over records, comparing deliveries, correcting totals, marking deficits, assigning labour. In some places, seals are pressed into wet clay to secure containers and storerooms. In others, papyrus carries lists and transactions through the hands of clerks trained to make the state legible to itself. The result is not efficiency in the modern sense. It is something more human and more fragile, a dense web of habits, obligations, and expectations strong enough to bind thousands of people into one system, but always vulnerable to delay, error, corruption, fear, and shortage. What survives in the record suggests that by the late 3rd millennium BC, several regions have become astonishingly good at this kind of organization. Egypt's Old Kingdom projects a serene confidence rooted in royal ideology and agricultural regularity. Mesopotamian polities, and eventually territorial states like Akkad, show how competitive city traditions can be fused into larger frameworks of power. Farther east, the urban centres of the Indus world reveal yet another version of organised life-planned streets, standardised weights, drainage systems, and far-reaching exchange, all hinting at high levels of coordination even if the precise structure of political authority remains debated. These societies differ deeply in language, religion, environment, and political form. Still, they share a dependence on steady yields and the social machinery that transforms those yields into enduring order. It is easy, looking back, to let the grandeur of kings and monuments dominate the story. Yet the real foundation of this world is not stone but grain. Grain is taxation, wages, diplomacy, famine prevention, ritual offering, and military endurance. Grain is the material form of trust in the future. To sow it is to believe that the river will return, that the canal will hold, that pests will not overwhelm the field, that labour will be available at harvest, that someone stronger than your neighbour's hunger will protect what has been gathered. In an age before industrial buffers and instant transport, food storage is a civilization's memory of good years, held back against uncertainty. When that memory begins to thin, everything above it becomes more brittle. A lesser known but revealing detail of these early agricultural systems is how much they alter the land even in prosperous times. Irrigation can increase production magnificently, but over long periods it can also create problems of its own. In southern Mesopotamia, for example, scholars have long noted the issue of salinization. When poor drainage and repeated evaporation leave salts accumulating in the soil, the evidence remains complex and regionally varied, and no single agricultural problem explains the wider collapse on its own. But the broader lesson is clear enough. Early abundance is not always simple abundance. Sometimes it is borrowed against the future. The same systems that make cities possible can slowly weaken the ecological base on which those cities depend. For ordinary people, however, the experience of this world is less abstract. It is tactile and repetitive. Feet sink into river mud, hands carry baskets, shape bricks, weed fields, mend nets, guide animals, and lift water. Grain dust hangs in the air of storage rooms. Fish dry in the sun. Reeds crackle under knife blades. Children learn routes between house, canal, and field before they understand the scale of the larger system that surrounds them. Their world is local, but the demands upon it are not. A field in one district may help sustain labour on a monument far away. Timber floated from distant lands may be destined for an elite workshop in a city the cutter will never see. A shortage in one region may tighten demands in another. Civilization, even at this early date, has already begun to create the strange moral geography of interconnected life. One household's routine tied invisibly to decisions made far beyond its horizon. This dependence on predictable environmental rhythms gives the great states of the age much of their power, but it also gives them a hidden weakness. The more successfully a kingdom organizes itself around expected flows of water, labor, and produce, the more damaging it becomes when those flows falter. A village can sometimes survive a poor season by adjusting quickly, relying on kin, mobility, or local improvisation. A large state must keep far more plates spinning at once. It must feed capitals, maintain garrisons, reward officials, sponsor cult activity, repair infrastructure, and preserve the aura of stability that justifies extraction in the first place. The palace and temple are not only centers of authority, they are mouths that must be fed. This is why prosperity in the ancient world often masks vulnerability. A packed granary does not merely announce success, it also reveals the level of coordination now required to avoid failure. A bustling river harbour implies dependence on continued movement. A rich administrative archive implies a society whose complexity must constantly be serviced by literate specialists and compliant local authorities. Even a well-maintained canal is a kind of warning. It says that this land is productive because many people have worked to make it so, and because many more will have to keep working for that productivity to continue. Stop the labour, weaken the authority, shift the water, or shrink the harvest, and the structure begins to loosen. Some of the most impressive cities of this age are therefore also strangely delicate. They can withstand raids, dynastic turnover, and local crop failure better than many smaller communities because they command resources over greater distances. Yet that very scale ensures that when pressure becomes broad and prolonged, the consequences may be much worse. The bigger the system, the more points at which strain can accumulate unseen. An official falsifies accounts. A canal repair is postponed. A district keeps back more grain than ordered. A local leader tests the limits of obedience. Herders arrive earlier than usual on the edges of cultivated land. The river behaves oddly for several years in succession. None of these on its own brings down a world. Together, under the right conditions, they begin to change its texture. And still the age carries on with extraordinary self-belief. Cities rise from plain and floodplain with the authority of things meant to last. From a distance they seem almost geological, as though they have grown naturally from earth and sun. Mud brick walls catch the light at evening. Temple platforms dominate the skyline. Granaries, workshops, wells, and courtyards press close within the protective envelope of urban life. Outside lie fields divided by paths and channels, then marsh, steppe, or desert. The boundary between civilization and outer uncertainty is never far away. Perhaps that closeness is part of what makes these societies so disciplined. They know what disorder looks like. They have built against it with all the tools available: labour, ritual, storage, force, and memory. Yet the evidence also suggests that by the end of the 3rd millennium BC, some of these tools are already being asked to do too much. Population has risen, bureaucracies have thickened, political ambitions have expanded, trade routes stretch farther. The demands placed on productive land have increased. What once felt like flexibility begins, in places, to harden into dependence. The system can still absorb disturbance, but not endlessly. And because success has lasted for generations, the possibility of genuine breakdown becomes harder to imagine, especially for those at the top. Administrators are trained to correct deficits, not to contemplate the failure of the whole design. Kings are expected to restore order, not admit that order may be slipping beyond command. So the ancient world continues to build on foundations that are both brilliant and exposed. Its cities of mud brick and grain remain full of noise, labour, and disciplined life. The canals still shine in the sun. The storehouses still hold enough to reassure. The roads still carry goods from far regions. But beneath the appearance of permanence lies a truth that only becomes obvious later. These civilizations are not stone resting on stone. They are seasonal achievements. Renewed by water and labour year after year, they endure not because they are invulnerable, but because enough things continue happening on time. And time, in the years ahead, is about to lose its old reliability. The roads will lengthen, The bureaucracy will thicken. The dreams of kings will grow larger than the landscapes beneath them. What is now a world of managed abundance will become a world strained by its own scale, where order depends increasingly on connections extending far beyond a single riverbank or city wall. When those connections begin to fray, the grain that once held everything together will no longer be enough by itself. As the cities grow denser and the storehouses fuller, the ancient world also learns how to stretch itself across distance. This is where organized civilization becomes something more than local abundance. A kingdom is not only fields and walls, it is roads kept open, officials kept loyal, messages carried, accounts compared, and goods pulled from landscapes that do not naturally belong together. Somewhere beyond the irrigated plain there is timber, beyond that, metal, beyond that, stone hard enough for blades or monuments, resin for sealing, bitumen for waterproofing, precious shells, rare pigments, fine textiles, and animals fit for transport. No early state possesses everything it wants within its own borders. Power, therefore, becomes a matter not merely of commanding people nearby, but of drawing distant things into a single system and making that system feel normal. This is one of the great achievements of the age before the collapse. In Mesopotamia especially, the world of cities and courts becomes increasingly dependent on long roads and river traffic linking alluvial lowlands to mountain margins, steppe frontiers, and maritime routes. Southern cities need raw materials they cannot produce themselves. They exchange finished goods, grain, wool, and political pressure for what lies beyond. Caravans move through exposed country where safety is never guaranteed. Boats follow the curves of rivers whose moods are not always kind. Intermediaries profit. Border settlements matter. Diplomatic marriages and military campaigns alike serve the same deeper purpose, securing the channels through which life and prestige flow. In Egypt, the pattern is different in detail, but similar in logic. The Nile provides a more coherent internal spine than Mesopotamia enjoys, but Egypt too reaches outward for cedar, copper, incense, decorative stone, and other goods that royal and elite culture increasingly expects. Expeditions move into desert zones and beyond the Nile Valley, gathering resources or asserting control over routes. Even when a kingdom appears inwardly serene, it is not self-contained. Monumental confidence rests partly on invisible lines of procurement and labour. A pyramid may seem like the purest statement of internal order, but it also depends on quarries, transport, food delivery, administrative oversight, and the discipline to coordinate all these things over time. Every grand object is the tip of a logistical iceberg. With this expansion comes bureaucracy, and bureaucracy, in its earliest mature forms, is a remarkable human invention. It lacks romance, but it gives civilization much of its muscle. Seals, ledgers, tablets, labels, boundary markers, quotas, and inventories allow rulers to imagine territories they will never personally see. A distant district becomes real to the centre when its grain counts arrive, when its labour obligations are listed, when its governor's seal appears on containers or correspondence. Writing, where it is used administratively, does not simply preserve language. It extends authority. It lets the state compare promises to deliveries, expected yield to actual yield, loyalty to suspicion. The temple and palace can only command at scale because they learn, however imperfectly, to measure. Yet measuring is not the same as controlling. What survives in the records suggests that these bureaucratic systems are always negotiating with local reality. Officials exaggerate success. Workers disappear. Records go missing. Taxation falls unevenly. Provincial elites pursue their own interests while outwardly affirming the ruler's greatness. Scholars still debate how tightly some of these states were actually integrated, especially at their edges. But the general pattern is clear enough. Early civilization becomes more interconnected, more ambitious, and more capable of projecting power over broad regions. At the same time, it becomes more dependent on compliance and communication across those same regions. Authority must travel if order is to endure. This is where the kings of the late 3rd millennium enter the story with such force. Their inscriptions present them as masters of geography itself. They conquer, subdue, build, restore, standardize, and punish. They boast of mountains crossed, rebellious lands humbled, tribute extracted, temples endowed, roads secured. The rhetoric is often formulaic and self-serving, as royal inscriptions tend to be, but even allowing for exaggeration, the scale of ambition is striking. Rulers no longer imagine themselves merely as local guardians of one city's patron god. Increasingly, they claim wider worlds. The imperial project in Mesopotamia, especially under the Akkadian kings, reveals a new confidence that diverse peoples, cities, and roots can be bound under one authority and made to serve a centre. There is strength in this, but also danger. Large territorial states can command more labour and draw on more resources than older city-based systems. They may suppress local warfare, facilitate exchange, and spread administrative habits across wider areas, but they are also expensive to maintain. Garrisons must be provisioned, roads must remain passable, provincial loyalty must be watched, conquered regions must continue paying more than they cost to hold. The farther a ruler's power extends, the greater the burden of enforcing the fiction that it extends equally everywhere. A city close to the centre may experience the state as daily reality. A distant frontier may experience it as occasional tax demand, military threat, or symbolic presence. The gap between those experiences matters, especially when pressure mounts. One lesser known but revealing feature of these early long-distance systems is how much they rely on trust between strangers who may never share a language or political identity. A caravan master must believe that agreements made upstream will hold downstream. A merchant or official must assume that sealed goods will reach their destination intact. A governor must trust that promised deliveries from dependent communities will actually appear. A ruler must trust reports sent by men whose survival may depend on telling him what he wants to hear. Civilization at scale is often described in terms of hierarchy, and hierarchy is certainly there. But daily function depends just as much on repeated expectations. When enough of those expectations fail, no proclamation from the centre can easily repair the damage. The temples stand at the centre of much of this world not only as religious institutions, but as anchors of legitimacy and economic gravity. Offerings flow in, rations flow out, labour is organised, land is managed, and divine favour is woven tightly into administrative life. The gods, in practical terms, are part of the political economy. A failed harvest is not just a material shortfall. It is a disturbance in the relationship between heaven, ruler, land, and people. A rebellious province is not just a fiscal problem. It is disorder in a moral universe. This matters because ancient states do not separate governance from cosmic meaning. Their endurance depends partly on the belief that order is divinely aligned. Once that belief begins to strain, the crack is deeper than a shortage on a tablet. And there are signs, even before the broad crisis becomes undeniable, that this high level of integration brings hidden fragility. Long-distance exchange is productive, but it can also expose core regions to disruptions far away. A problem on the frontier becomes a shortage at the centre. Trouble in a mountain zone affects metal supply. Insecurity on a trade route raises costs, delays shipments, and weakens elite confidence. A province under pressure may hold back grain or fail to send labour. In prosperous times, large systems absorb such shocks. In difficult times, each interruption compounds the others. No single broken road destroys an empire. A world in which many roads become less reliable at once is another matter. The ancient world at this stage resembles a woven fabric pulled increasingly taut. Each new strand adds strength, but only if the tension remains balanced. Royal power, temple wealth, irrigation agriculture, military coercion, and interregional trade reinforce one another. Grain feeds labour. Labour maintains canals and monuments. Canals support harvests. Harvests support armies and temples. Armies protect routes. Routes bring prestige goods and strategic materials that enhance royal authority. Authority extracts more labour and grain. It is a magnificent loop when conditions hold. It is also the sort of loop that can begin to unravel from several points at once. There is something almost modern in this ancient dependency, though the materials are different. No one here speaks of supply chains, systemic risk, or administrative overstretch, but the underlying problem is recognizable. Complex societies function by multiplying connections faster than they multiply slack. Success encourages extension. Extension increases dependence. Dependence reduces room for surprise. A few years of strain may be manageable. A decade of overlapping strain begins to reveal how much apparent strength has been purchased through delicate coordination. Scholars still debate the exact balance between central control and regional autonomy in many of these states, but no debate alters the essential vulnerability. The more the world is tied together, the more trouble can travel. For ordinary people, this wider integration may appear in humble forms. A tool made from distant metal, a jar shape copied from elsewhere, a ration delayed because an official convoy has not arrived, foreign names in a market, new goods in elite households that announce far horizons to those who can afford them. For the ruling class, those same horizons are signs of triumph. They prove that the king's arm is long, the gods favourable, the administration competent. Yet triumph always contains its own temptation. Once a state grows used to commanding distant resources and peoples, retreat becomes hard to imagine. The system is no longer built merely to survive. It is built to perform scale. That performance matters, because ancient kingship is not modest. It must appear effective, inexhaustible, ordained. When harvests are good and routes secure, the image can be sustained. Monuments rise, temples flourish, inscriptions celebrate dominion, and the world seems to affirm the ruler's place in it. But if resources tighten, if local governors grow restless, if climate begins pressing on the margins and then the core, the image becomes harder to maintain. Royal power can survive hardship if it retains credibility. Once credibility itself is damaged, every shortage becomes politically louder. So by the time the late 3rd millennium approaches its great turning point, the ancient world has become both stronger and more exposed than before. Its kings command broader territories. Its temples and administrations reach deeper into daily life. Its roads and riverways carry wealth across immense distances. Its confidence in organized order has matured into something close to civilizational certainty. Yet certainty rests on movement, balance, obedience, and environmental regularity. Remove enough of any of those, and the magnificence begins to look less like permanence than like tension held in shape. For a while longer, the long roads remain open, The seals are still pressed into clay. The temple storerooms still fill and empty according to schedule. The king's words still travel farther than any common labourer ever will. But the system is growing tighter, and the world beyond the fields and canals is not obliged to remain cooperative. Somewhere on the horizon, the first real strains are gathering, not yet full collapse, but enough to test whether these kingdoms are as solid as they believe. Soon the early warnings will stop looking like isolated inconveniences and begin to reveal a pattern. The first signs of strain do not arrive dressed as catastrophe. They come looking ordinary, even familiar, which is part of why they are so easy for states to misunderstand. A poor harvest can be explained away. A rebellious district can be punished. A shortage in one storehouse can be corrected by moving grain from another. Roads have always been dangerous in some seasons. Borderlands have always required attention. The machinery of early civilization is built to manage trouble. And for a long time, that ability encourages confidence. If problems appear, the answer is to issue orders, send officials, invoke the gods, tighten collection, restore canals, and remind everyone that the centre still governs. Yet what begins to emerge in the later 3rd millennium BC is not a single problem with a single remedy. It is a clustering of pressures that start to reinforce one another. In the written and archaeological record, these early warnings are often frustratingly indirect. Ancient states are not in the habit of producing calm, transparent reports explaining that conditions are deteriorating and the future looks uncertain. Kings prefer victory inscriptions. Administrators prefer accounts that preserve the appearance of competence. Priestly and elite texts are not designed as neutral social diagnosis, so the signs must be read sideways. A settlement shrinks. A formerly busy district shows fewer durable traces. Fortifications are strengthened. Royal inscriptions become more defensive in tone, or more insistent in their claims to have subdued disorder. Letters complain of insecurity, difficulty, disobedience, labour shortages, or delayed deliveries. A layer of abandonment appears where continuity might have been expected. None of this alone proves a civilization is entering crisis. Together, over time, they begin to look like a system working harder for worse results. What survives in the record suggests that by the decades around 2200 BC, some regions are already living with this deepening friction. In Mesopotamia, the imperial structure of Akkad extends across a wide and varied landscape. But the very ambition of that structure makes strain more consequential. Its rulers must hold core cities, maintain authority in conquered territories, secure routes, and keep supplies moving across long distances. This would be demanding even under favourable conditions. Under growing environmental and political pressure, it becomes more so. Local resistance does not disappear because the empire exists. It merely changes form. Peripheral groups test the edges. Provincial loyalty can turn conditional. If harvests weaken or movement becomes less reliable, every frontier issue becomes more dangerous because the centre has less surplus with which to solve it. In Egypt, where ideology has long presented royal authority as the guarantor of cosmic order, the first signs of difficulty are no less unsettling for being less dramatic at first glance. The Nile remains the great organising fact of the land, but that means any irregularity in its behaviour carries wide consequences. A single low inundation may be survivable. Repeated weakness in flood levels, or even the perception of declining reliability, touches everything at once. The fields yield less. The state collects less. Local elites become more important as immediate providers or protectors. the centre's ability to command labour and project effortless confidence begins, almost invisibly, to erode. No one needs to announce a crisis for one to be felt. It enters through thinner margins. One of the more revealing features of early strain is that it rarely affects all classes or all regions equally at first. Elites can cushion themselves. Temples and palaces have stores, access, and political leverage. A poor village at the edge of cultivation may feel scarcity sooner than a court in the capital. Herding groups may experience changing pasture conditions before irrigated farmers fully understand what is happening. A district already near the ecological or political edge will register instability before the centre feels compelled to name it. This unevenness delays recognition. It allows rulers to interpret the early signs as local failures rather than system-wide change. It also creates resentment. Communities asked to deliver the same dues under worsening conditions do not always respond with quiet obedience. Scholars still debate the exact sequence in different regions, and the evidence remains incomplete. But one broad pattern appears again and again. In collapsing systems, pressure accumulates before ideology adapts. The official language of stability lingers long after the material basis of stability has begun to shift. That lag is crucial. A ruler whose legitimacy depends on providing order has strong incentives to behave as though order remains secure. Officials beneath him have incentives to pass along manageable versions of bad news. Local elites have incentives to protect their own position first. In such a world, the truth does not travel easily. The centre may respond to scarcity by demanding more. Exactly when demanding more is the most dangerous thing it can do. This dynamic can be imagined in the simplest terms. A harvest disappoints. The administration still expects its due. Grain collected for taxation or redistribution leaves a village with less to spare. Families sell animals, tools, or future labour to survive. Pasture is overused. Irrigation maintenance is deferred because people are too hungry, too indebted, too absent, or too resentful to provide the necessary labour. The next year's productivity suffers. Movement increases. Theft becomes more tempting. The local official, under pressure from above, grows harsher rather than wiser. Scarcity hardens into instability not because ancient people fail to understand hardship, but because the institutions built for abundance are often clumsy in conditions of contraction. There are also hints, in some regions, of growing insecurity along routes and margins. This matters more than it might seem. An empire or kingdom can absorb a bad year more easily if roads remain open and neighbouring districts remain cooperative. Once insecurity spreads, adjustment becomes harder. Grain cannot be moved efficiently. Messages travel more slowly or not at all. Troops sent to solve one problem create shortages somewhere else. Caravans grow more expensive to protect. The cost of maintaining order rises as the resources available to maintain it decline. This is one of the classic traps of overstretched systems. Their need for control increases at the very moment their means are weakening. A lesser known but telling clue to early strain is the change in how places are inhabited. Collapse is not always visible first in monuments or royal centres. It may appear in altered settlement patterns, small sites abandoned, larger defensible locations favoured, formerly cultivated zones used less intensively, populations concentrating around more secure water or transport lines. Sometimes this looks, in archaeological terms, less like sudden destruction than like a gradual thinning. Life becomes patchier. The map of habitation loses density before it loses all continuity. That can make the crisis easy to underestimate from a distance. Yet for the people living through it, thinning is its own form of warning. A neighbour leaves, a field lies uncultivated, a road feels emptier, a market has fewer goods. Silence begins appearing in places once sustained by routine. At the same time, the political language of command often grows sharper. When rulers feel secure, they can afford a degree of magnanimity in inscription and display. When they sense instability, rhetoric may become more anxious beneath its confidence. Rebellions are crushed, enemies scattered, order restored, gods appeased. The insistence itself becomes meaningful. It suggests not that disorder is absent, but that it is near enough to require repeated theatrical defeat. Royal boasting is never a simple mirror of reality, but neither is it meaningless. Sometimes the louder a state speaks of order, the more reason it has to fear disorder. There is also the slow problem of trust. Civilizations do not survive on grain alone. They survive because people at different levels continue believing that compliance today will not mean ruin tomorrow. Farmers bring produce because they expect some continuity in return. Local elites remain loyal because the center still looks useful. Soldiers fight because rations arrive. Scribes record because the system still rewards precision. Once that trust thins, even before institutions visibly collapse, behavior changes, hoarding increases, localism strengthens, obligations are fulfilled more reluctantly or evaded where possible. Officials begin serving themselves more openly. Communities think first of surviving the season, not preserving the glory of the state. This does not mean everyone sees what is coming. Most people rarely do in any age. Daily life continues, and necessity leaves little room for historical overview. Children are still born, bread is still baked, nets are repaired, offerings are made, disputes over land, animals, and water still fill local attention. That continuity is part of what makes the first stage of collapse so difficult to narrate. It is not a world falling all at once into darkness. It is a world developing a harder edge. More labor for less certainty, more demand for less reward, more movement, more rumor, more fragile confidence. The same institutions remain visible, but they no longer feel quite as dependable. What makes these first signs so ominous in retrospect is that they show how little margin some of these great systems truly possess. For generations, rulers have interpreted continuity as proof of strength. In fact, continuity may have depended on climatic and political conditions more favorable than anyone fully appreciated. Once those conditions begin to shift, the resilience of the system is tested for the first time at scale. Can irrigation states handle repeated stress? Can territorial empires manage shrinking returns? Can divine kingship absorb visible environmental failure without losing authority? The evidence suggests that, in many places, the answer is not for long. So the warnings accumulate, not yet as a single recognizable disaster, but as a change in atmosphere. The ancient world still stands, temples still receive offerings, officials still count deliveries, kings still announce triumph. Yet, beneath that surface, the old assumptions are being challenged by realities harder to command. The canals need more care, the roads require more force, the harvest inspires less confidence, the outskirts feel less governable. The people closest to the soil and the pasture sense it first, because they always do. Something in the old rhythm is faltering. Soon the problem will become harder to dismiss as local misfortune or administrative inconvenience. The pressure gathering across these worlds will move from warning into cause, and from cause into visible damage. The sky itself, which has long underwritten the labour of kings and farmers alike, will begin to matter more than any decree written on clay or stone. Then the sky withholds its rain. Not everywhere at once, not with the clean precision of a line drawn across a map, and not in a way that every community experiences in exactly the same season. Ancient climate does not move like a switch being flipped. It shifts through patterns, belts, winds, temperatures, flood behavior, and the timing of storms. But around the centuries bracketing 2200 BC, a broad and deeply unsettling change appears to emerge across significant parts of the Near East and neighbouring regions. Conditions become drier, in some places sharply so, and for long enough to push already stressed human systems toward breaking point. Scholars still debate the speed, regional variation, and exact mechanism of this event, and no single explanation fully accounts for every local outcome. Even so, what survives in lake sediments, cave deposits, marine cores, river records, and archaeological layers suggest that this is not merely a run of ordinary bad years. It is climate instability on a scale large enough to alter history. For the people living beneath that changing sky, there is no scientific language for atmospheric circulation or abrupt aridification. There is only the practical experience of seasons becoming less trustworthy. Clouds gather less often. Rains fail farther upstream. Winds carry more dust. Pasture recovers poorly. Wells grow uncertain. The flood arrives weakly, or not with its usual confidence. Sowing becomes riskier because the old assumptions no longer hold. In landscapes where a single good season cannot erase the effects of several bad ones, this matters immediately. A farming community can survive hardship, but drought is not merely the absence of water, it is the shrinking of options. One of the most haunting things about ancient climate stress is how difficult it can be to perceive at first from within daily life. A dry year is not yet a transformation of the world. A second dry year is frightening, but still survivable. A third begins to feel like a sentence. By then, seed reserves may already be depleted, animals weakened, debts impossible, social trust thinned. The sky does not need to become permanently barren to destroy stability. It needs only to become unreliable often enough, for long enough, that the systems built around expectation can no longer keep pace. What survives in the environmental record suggests just such a breakdown in reliability. In parts of Mesopotamia, Syria, and surrounding regions, evidence points towards severe drying. Dust increases, settlement patterns shift. Some agricultural zones appear to contract. In Egypt, low Nile floods may reflect reduced rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands that feed the river's inundation. Far from the court, the atmosphere changes first in the only language ordinary people truly need. There is less water than there should be. The old civilizations are badly suited to this kind of uncertainty, because their strength has been built around regularity. Egypt's agricultural rhythm depends on the Nile rising with enough generosity to renew the fields. Mesopotamian irrigation agriculture depends on sustained river behavior, manageable salinity, organized labor, and enough moisture in the wider system to support crops and grazing. Dry farming regions farther north are even more directly exposed. There, agriculture may depend on seasonal rainfall crossing a threshold below which fields no longer justify the effort. This is one reason climate stress can redraw political maps without any army intending it. A few degrees, a few storms missed, a few seasons of reduced moisture, and one entire zone becomes harder to inhabit densely. What was once a productive margin becomes a frontier of loss. A lesser-known detail, but an important one, is that climate events do not injure all landscapes in the same way. River valleys may retain some resilience longer than upland rain-fed zones. Irrigated centres may hold on for a time while pastoral hinterlands degrade. Areas with storage, political coordination, or access to multiple food sources may delay the worst effects. Yet that unevenness can make the wider crisis even more dangerous. It creates movement. People leave zones that no longer feed them and press toward places that still seem viable. Herders seek pasture nearer cultivated land. Villagers drift towards stronger centres. The centre, already stressed, experiences this not as climate but as disorder. A drying sky becomes a political problem in human form. In the archaeological record, climate rarely speaks with a single voice. It leaves proxies, fragments, correlations, a dust layer here, a reduced water signal there, pollen shifts, mineral traces, speleothems in caves whose chemical composition records changes in rainfall over time. These forms of evidence are powerful, but they do not produce perfect certainty. Scholars continue refining the chronology, debating how precisely the climate event aligns with individual collapses and how directly environmental stress can be linked to political failure. That caution matters. It prevents easy storytelling. The ancient world does not fall simply because nature turns hostile. Human choices, administrative rigidity, inequality, conflict, and local ecology all shape the outcome. Still, the broader pattern is difficult to ignore. Around 2200 BC, the climate appears to change in ways that made many already complex societies less able to sustain themselves. Imagine a farming district at the edge of viability under such conditions. The first year, families cope by drawing on stored grain, reducing consumption, or hoping the next flood or rain will restore balance. The second year, they may slaughter animals they would rather keep, neglect maintenance, or borrow against future harvests. The third year, households begin breaking apart. Younger men leave to seek labour or food elsewhere. Women and elders try to preserve what remains. Tools are traded. Seed is eaten. Rituals become more urgent because practical measures are failing. By the time outside observers record migration, unrest, or abandonment, the real collapse has already been underway in kitchens, courtyards, and fields for years. This is why drought can be more devastating than sudden disaster. A flood, earthquake, or invasion strikes visibly. Drought enters everything without drama. It strips strength slowly. It thins people before it kills them. It turns cooperation into calculation. It forces rulers into choices that reveal how narrow their margins truly are. Raise demands and provoke rebellion. Lower demands and starve the apparatus of state. Move grain from one district to save another and create resentment. Fail to move it and lose authority. A climate crisis is never only environmental once a society depends on administrative order. It becomes a test of who is allowed to survive with dignity and who is expected to absorb the loss. In some parts of the Near East, the evidence suggests that formerly occupied zones were reduced or abandoned during this broad period of aridity. Dust from expanding drylands may have reached areas once buffered by more stable vegetation. In northern Mesopotamia and Syria, settlement contraction has often been linked to declining rainfall and agricultural stress. The precise local picture remains debated, but the overall impression is one of shrinking ecological confidence. Land that once supported villages no longer does so as reliably. The map of habitability begins to tighten, and when the map tightens, politics hardens with it. Egypt offers a different but equally revealing example. There, the issue is not ordinary rainfall over the core agricultural zone so much as the behaviour of the Nile, whose flood depends on distant rainfall beyond the immediate gaze of Egyptian communities. When the inundation is strong, the kingdom appears blessed, ordered, almost cosmically assured. When the inundation weakens repeatedly, the entire ideological structure of abundance becomes harder to maintain. The king may still be king, the temples still active, the bureaucracy still in place. But the river has introduced doubt into the deepest level of public life. No amount of inscription can make a poor flood generous. There is a quiet cruelty in this. Early civilizations often persuade themselves that order has been achieved through moral and political superiority. Climate reminds them that order is also borrowed from conditions beyond their control. The best administration in the world cannot command rain from an empty sky. It can only redistribute the pain of not having it. Some rulers likely responded with sincerity and effort, others with force, denial, or ritual display. Most probably did all of these in shifting measures, because ancient governments, like modern ones, seldom confront systemic crisis with pure wisdom. They improvise from inside institutions built for another world. And yet it would be wrong to imagine helplessness alone. People adapt where they can. They shift crops, move herds, deepen ties with kin, seek new water, reconfigure settlements, and lower expectations of what stability means. But adaptation has limits, especially when many communities are pressed at once. What makes the 2200 BC crisis so historically powerful is not just that climate worsens. It is that climate worsens in landscapes already carrying heavy civilizational weight. There are more mouths to feed, more officials to satisfy, more boundaries to police, more assumptions to defend. A changing sky strikes not isolated hamlets, but interconnected worlds. So the warning hardens into cause. What had looked like scattered signs of strain begins to align with a broader environmental shift. The old confidence of river and season becomes harder to maintain. The labour of farmers grows more desperate. The calculations of administrators grow more brittle. Dust and hunger begin doing what rival kings and frontier raiders alone could not easily do. They expose the dependence hidden inside grandeur. The state can endure enemies. It can even endure a bad year. What it cannot endure indefinitely is a sky that ceases to cooperate with the foundations of its own existence. Soon the consequences will become visible in the most material terms possible. Fields will fail more clearly, rivers will disappoint, soils will turn from burden to dangerous, pastures will shrink, and the struggle to keep people fed will move from anxious possibility to open reality. When that happens, the crisis will no longer belong only to climate scientists reading ancient cores and sediments thousands of years later. It will belong to every household measuring what is left in the jar. Once the sky begins to fail, the crisis descends from abstraction into the blunt arithmetic of survival. A civilization can debate causes only in retrospect. The people living through it know the problem in simpler terms. The field yields less than it should. The canal carries less certainty. The animals return leaner from grazing, if they return at all. Seed grain, once guarded as the promise of the next year, becomes food for the present because hunger does not respect agricultural prudence. Under those conditions, environmental stress stops being a matter of weather and becomes a daily erosion of everything that once made settled life feel dependable. In much of the ancient world, productive land is never merely land. It is a system of expectations layered over soil. Farmers know when water should arrive, when mud should soften, when sowing should begin, when pasture should recover, when the grain heads ought to thicken. The state knows when collection should happen. Temples know when offerings should be drawn from surplus. Labour overseers know when workers can be redirected to canals, walls, quarries, or roads. When these timings begin to slip, the disturbance spreads outward through every layer of society. Crops fail first in the field, but failure does not remain there. It moves into granaries, tax demands, debt, migration, and violence. A bad season becomes a political season. In Egypt, the most feared version of this begins with the Nile. A weak inundation does not simply mean less water, it means less silt, less reach, less confidence. The river has always been more than a physical feature. It is the pulse around which Egyptian order has learned to beat. When that pulse becomes faint, the fields shrink in practice even if the map of Egypt remains the same. Low waters expose the kingdom's dependence with humiliating clarity. The floodplain cannot pretend. If the black earth does not spread widely enough, then grain does not grow widely enough, and all the ideological confidence of kingship must confront the mud itself. In Mesopotamia, the problem is harsher in a different way. Here, agriculture often depends on active management of water through irrigation, and irrigation is powerful only as long as water remains available. Channels remain maintained, and soils remain healthy enough to reward the effort. Under stress, every part of that chain becomes more vulnerable. Lower flows or disrupted schedules mean canals carry less security into the fields. Maintenance lags when labourers are hungry, absent, or drafted elsewhere. Waterlogging and salinisation, already long-term concerns in some southern areas, may become more punishing when systems are strained and agricultural choices narrow. The evidence remains regionally varied, and no single agricultural mechanism explains all decline. But what survives in the record suggests that some lands once pushed hard for production become steadily less forgiving. Civilization has forced abundance from difficult terrain for generations. Now the terrain begins to answer back. There is a terrible intimacy to crop failure. It is easy to speak of drought in large, smooth terms, but the experience itself is granular. A farmer notices the sprouting is thin. Another sees that the colour of the young plants is wrong. In one district, heads of barley form poorly. In another, the grain fills badly. Fodder for animals becomes scarce, which means less manure, less traction, fewer surviving herds, and a weaker recovery even if rains improve later. The old buffer between one poor year and total collapse begins to vanish. Surplus, once accumulated as protection, is consumed. Then tools are sold, livestock are culled, debts deepen, and finally households begin abandoning what they once would have defended to the end. Pastoral and semi-pastoral communities feel the same pressure through pasture lands and water points. Grass recovers poorly. Seasonal routes become more contested. Wells or marsh edges can no longer support the same numbers. Herders are forced closer to cultivated zones, not because they suddenly become more aggressive by nature, but because the geography of survival has narrowed. This matters enormously for settled states, which often interpret incoming mobile groups as threats before they understand them as symptoms. A drying environment turns ecology into politics by forcing different communities into sharper competition over the same shrinking resources. The boundary between migration and raiding, between desperate movement and organized incursion, can grow thin under such conditions. What survives in the archaeological and environmental records suggests that some regions may have crossed critical thresholds during this period. Rain-fed zones in northern Mesopotamia and Syria appear, in some cases, to contract or depopulate. Settlements thin out. Occupation becomes patchier. Dust layers and other signs of aridity hint at worsening conditions. Scholars still debate the exact chronology and severity site by site, and caution is necessary because ancient landscapes never respond uniformly. Still, the overall picture is hard to soften. Fields fail not only as isolated accidents, but as part of a wider reduction in agricultural reliability. Rivers, too, become less trustworthy. And in early civilization, trust in water is nearly the same thing as trust in the future. A lesser-known but revealing detail is that even where water remains present, it may no longer be useful in the old way. Too little water is obvious. Poorly managed water can be just as dangerous over time. Irrigation without sufficient drainage can leave salts behind, gradually poisoning yields. Channel systems can silt up, break, or distribute water unevenly. Lower flows can intensify conflict over access. In this sense, the crisis is not just one of quantity, but of control. States that once defined themselves through their ability to organize land and water now discover that organization has limits. A canal can be commanded, a watershed cannot. A labor crew can be assembled, a depleted river cannot be ordered to recover. For ordinary households, the consequences accumulate with brutal logic. Less grain means smaller rations. Smaller rations mean weaker labor. Weaker labor means poorer maintenance of fields, canals, terraces, storage, and transport. Poorer maintenance means lower future yields. In bad years, people can still draw on networks of kin, patrons, or local reserves. In repeated bad years, those same networks begin to fray because everyone is asking at once. The state may intervene. But state intervention can itself become predatory when officials are under pressure to preserve central revenues. What appears in elite accounting as collection may appear in village memory as stripping the desperate of what little remains. This is where famine enters, not always as a single dramatic event of corpses in the street, though such scenes may have occurred, but as prolonged nutritional collapse. People eat less and worse. They consume what should be saved. They move in search of food. Children survive at lower odds. Disease becomes more dangerous because bodies are weakened. Social obligations become harder to sustain when every household is calculating how thin its stores can be stretched. In some later Egyptian text looking back on disorder, famine and social inversion become central themes, though the exact relationship between literary memory and historical conditions remains debated. Even so, the persistence of such themes suggests how deeply food insecurity marked the cultural imagination of collapse. The state, meanwhile, faces its own impossible choices. Granaries that once testified to order now look insufficient. To preserve royal authority, food must still move to where it is symbolically and politically necessary. Temples expect support. Officials expect payment. Garrisons cannot be left unfed. But every measure of redistribution is also a measure of triage. Save the centre, and the margins may break away. Save the frontier, and the core may lose confidence. Reduce demands. And the administrative machine weakens. Maintain demands, and rebellion becomes more likely. No single explanation fully accounts for why some states hold longer than others, but the underlying dilemma is plain. The very institutions that once magnified abundance now magnify scarcity. There is also a psychological transformation that often goes unrecorded directly, but can be inferred from the material change. A field that once promised continuity becomes a place of doubt. Seasonal labour loses its old meaning if the result is no longer reliable. Rituals continue, but their emotional texture shifts. The gods are still invoked. The offerings may simply grow more anxious. Neighbours who once cooperated over timing and water begin watching one another more warily. Children grow up with a different memory of what normal looks like. This is one of the hidden consequences of environmental crisis. It does not only empty storehouses, it rewrites expectation. And still, not every place fails in exactly the same way. Some communities adapt better, retreating into smaller, more localized patterns of survival. Others exploit wetlands, fishing grounds, mixed economies, or trade advantages to hold on longer. Some elites may genuinely organize relief. Others may turn crisis into an opportunity for harsher extraction. Archaeology rarely gives us the full moral texture of those choices, but it preserves their consequences. A site continues or contracts. A cemetery changes. Storage patterns alter. Imported goods disappear. Buildings once maintained with care begin to decay. Little by little, the material language of confidence is replaced by the material language of coping. This is the stage at which collapse stops being a distant process and becomes the condition of daily life. The fields are no longer trustworthy enough to sustain the scale of the old world. Rivers no longer guarantee what they once seemed to guarantee. Pastures no longer absorb the same pressures. The crisis moves through the most basic elements of subsistence until there is no part of society untouched by it. Palaces may still stand. Temples may still perform rituals. Kings may still speak in the old voice of command, but underneath them the agricultural base has become unstable. And when the food system of an ancient civilization begins to wobble, politics follows quickly. The empires and kingdoms of this age are about to discover that grandeur cannot be eaten. Their monuments will outlast the trouble. Their claims of divine favour will survive in carved stone. But the real measure of power is shifting from proclamation to provision, from ceremony to grain, from royal certainty to whether the next ration arrives at all. In that world, cracking fields and unreliable rivers are not background conditions. They are the beginning of the end for any state that has forgotten how close authority always lives to hunger. By the time the environmental stress becomes impossible to treat as a passing hardship, the great political structures of the age are already in danger. Empires do not collapse only because rain fails. They collapse because every existing weakness is suddenly forced into the open. The rulers of the late 3rd millennium BC inherit systems built for expansion, display, and command. They are used to solving problems by sending troops, appointing governors, issuing decrees, and drawing more resources from the lands under their control. Those tools can be effective against rivals, rebels, and local disruptions. They are far less effective against a world in which the productive base itself is shrinking, and the cost of holding everything together rises year after year. Nowhere is this more striking than in the Akkadian world. To later historians, the Akkadian Empire often appears as one of the first great territorial experiments in human history, a state that stretches beyond the older pattern of fiercely independent city-states and attempts something larger, more centralized, more audacious. Under rulers such as Sargon and his successors, power extends over broad parts of Mesopotamia and into neighboring regions. Royal inscriptions present a world subdued by force and stabilized by imperial will. Cities that once fought one another are drawn, however imperfectly, into a wider political framework. Tribute flows. Garrisons hold key points. The king's authority travels farther than older traditions might once have imagined possible. It is an extraordinary achievement, and like many extraordinary achievements, it contains the seeds of its own strain. An empire of this kind must do more than conquer. It must continue paying for conquest after the excitement of conquest has faded. Soldiers must be fed whether the harvest is good or poor. Governors must be trusted or watched. Roads must stay open across lands that never stop having their own interests. Subject populations must remain profitable enough to justify the trouble of ruling them. Every triumph widens the zone of obligation. When conditions are favourable, the breadth is a source of resilience. If one district suffers, another may compensate. If one route becomes unstable, another may still function. But under broader climatic and agricultural stress, the same breadth becomes a burden. The state is stretched across too many vulnerable surfaces at once. What survives in the historical tradition suggests that the later Akkadian rulers confront precisely this kind of tightening world. The famous Curse of Agard, composed later and shaped by literary and theological aims rather than direct reporting, cannot be read as straightforward history. Yet it is revealing all the same. In its memory, the imperial centre is associated with divine displeasure, failed abundance, and a landscape turning against human order. Grain fails. Fish disappear from the marshes. Clouds do not rain. The text dramatizes collapse through moral and cosmic language, as ancient literature often does. But the images it preserves are telling. Later generations remember Akkad not simply as defeated by enemies, but as overtaken by a world in which prosperity itself had been withdrawn. The archaeological and textual evidence remains uneven, and scholars continue debating the pace and exact causes of Akkad's decline. No single explanation fully accounts for the empire's end. Political instability, succession problems, military pressure, and local resistance all matter. The role of groups such as the Gutians, long depicted in Mesopotamian tradition as destructive outsiders from the highlands, must also be handled carefully. Ancient elite texts often turn peripheral peoples into convenient villains, simplifying more complicated realities of migration, opportunism, and frontier weakness. Even so, the broad picture is difficult to miss. An imperial state already dependent on heavy extraction and long-distance control becomes far more brittle when agricultural reliability declines and regional stress intensifies. The empire begins to crack not at one point, but along many seams. One of those seams lies in legitimacy. Early empires are costly not only in grain and labour but in belief. People must continue acting as though the centre is worth obeying. Provincial elites must find advantage in imperial order. Soldiers must trust that service leads to support. Administrators must believe that records still correspond to a functioning reality. When crops fail and surplus narrows, imperial power loses one of its most persuasive arguments. It can still threaten. It can still punish, but coercion without abundance is an expensive way to rule. The more a state must rely on force because it can no longer guarantee stability, the more that force drains the very resources it is meant to protect. Imagine the pressure from the perspective of a provincial district under Akkadian oversight. The centre still expects dues. The local harvest is weaker. Pastoral movements along the margins have become more difficult to manage. Perhaps neighbouring communities are also under strain and less willing to cooperate. Officials sent from the centre may appear less like guardians of order than like men arriving to take what remains. If the state weakens even slightly, local leaders begin recalculating. Loyalty that once seemed natural becomes contingent. It is not necessary for every province to rebel openly. The empire can be mortally weakened simply by growing harder to administer and less worth preserving. There is also the basic military problem of fighting under scarcity. Armies in the ancient world move on food, animals, transport, and organization. They are not abstract instruments. If the grain base weakens, the cost of keeping troops supplied becomes sharper. A campaign that would once have been manageable can become ruinously expensive. Frontier defense becomes more difficult if the center is already pulling resources inward. Garrisons may be left vulnerable or underfed. Communication slows. The empire's outer frame loosens first, not because the center stops claiming authority, but because the practical means of making that authority felt begin to fail. In such conditions, mobile groups from the periphery can become far more disruptive than they would be in stronger years. Pressure that might once have been contained is now amplified by exhaustion at the core. A lesser known but important aspect of imperial fragility is that administrative success can disguise local dependence for a long time. Tablets, seals, and official titles create an image of continuity even as the underlying relationships they represent deteriorate. An archive may continue to function in one city, while neighbouring districts are already depopulating or slipping out of effective control. Royal inscriptions may speak in the old language of victory after the real capacity to project power has narrowed. This lag between representation and material reality matters greatly. It allows the empire to appear intact on paper or in stone while, in practice, it is losing depth. Collapse is often recognized by historians only when the center itself falls silent, but by then the weakening has usually been underway for years. What survives in the settlement record from parts of northern Mesopotamia and Syria has often been read as evidence of major disruption around this broader period contraction. Abandonment, reduced density, and changing patterns of occupation. Scholars still debate how directly these shifts map onto the political history of Akkad, but they are consistent with a world in which the imperial system is no longer operating over the same inhabited and productive landscape it once relied upon. If dry farming zones decline, then imperial revenues shrink. If people move, then obligations become harder to enforce. If insecurity spreads, then holding territory becomes more expensive precisely when it is less rewarding. The empire is caught in a narrowing cycle. The Gutians, remembered in later Mesopotamian texts as rude destroyers from the mountains, occupy a curious place in this story. They may well reflect real incursions or power shift from highland groups into weakened lowland systems. But the literary image of barbaric outsiders overrunning civilization should not be accepted too simply. Civilizations in crisis often explain their downfall by blaming those beyond the frontier, because it is easier than admitting that the center had become vulnerable from within. Frontier groups may have taken advantage of Akkad's weakness. They may have contributed directly to political fragmentation, yet they are better understood as part of the collapse than as its sole cause. When an empire is healthy, its margins are manageable. When the margins become unmanageable, it is usually because something deeper has already gone wrong. And deeper things had gone wrong. The fields were less secure. Surplus had become harder to maintain. The burden of governing far-flung territories no longer yielded the same returns. The imperial dream, so confident in periods of expansion, encountered ecological and political realities it could not command into obedience. The evidence remains incomplete, and historians must be careful not to force every local change into one neat imperial narrative. Still, the broad transformation is clear enough. Akkad ceases to function as the dominant organizing force it once seemed to be. Power fragments. Regional patterns reassert themselves. The old coherence of the imperial map begins to dissolve. This does not mean that cities everywhere vanish overnight. Some continue, adapt, or reconfigure. Life goes on in altered forms. That is the nature of ancient collapse. But the empire's claim to hold the world together weakens beyond repair, and once that claim is broken, the consequences reach beyond the court. Trade patterns shift, administrative habits change, Local authorities rise. Communities once integrated into a wider order must improvise under narrower horizons. The imperial centre, which had drawn wealth and obedience toward itself for decades, can no longer guarantee what justified that flow in the first place. There is a bleak irony in this. The Akkadian Empire may have represented one of the earliest and boldest attempts to turn a patchwork of cities and territories into a single commanded world. Its rulers could plausibly believe that they had surpassed older limits of fragmentation. Yet the greater the scale of that success, the greater the shock when it failed. A village can suffer and remain a village. An empire, once it begins to lose the conditions that made empire possible, has farther to fall. Its roads become liabilities, its frontiers become wounds, its capital becomes a memory. So the cracks widen. The imperial language of inevitability gives way to the reality of scarcity, local resistance, and failing control. The ancient world is learning that overextension is not always obvious in times of triumph. It becomes visible when the weather worsens, the grain thins, and the cost of command finally exceeds what the land can support. Soon another great state, outwardly very different but vulnerable in its own way, will enter the same long shadow, in Egypt. The collapse will not look exactly like Akkad's. The river, the ideology, and the political form are different, but there too, the old assurance is beginning to fail. Egypt enters its long shadow more quietly than an empire collapsing under frontier pressure. But the silence is deceptive. For generations the kingdom has presented itself as the nearest thing the ancient world possesses to permanence made visible. The Nile rises and falls. The black soil renews itself. The king stands at the centre of cosmic balance, and stone monuments climb toward a horizon that seems beyond argument. If Mesopotamia often reveals its instability through competition, conquest, and exposed complexity, Egypt's old kingdom projects a different kind of confidence, serene, centralized, almost insulated from the noise of uncertainty. That is precisely why its weakening is so unsettling. When a state built on order begins to fray, every sign of strain feels like a disturbance in the natural structure of the world. The brilliance of Old Kingdom Egypt rests on a narrow environmental miracle. A thin river valley cutting through arid land becomes one of the great engines of early civilization because the Nile usually behaves with enough generosity to make planning possible. The flood comes, spreads, retreats, and leaves behind the dark, fertile earth on which agriculture depends. This does not make Egyptian life effortless. It only makes large-scale coordination meaningful. The state can tax, store, redistribute, and mobilize labor because the annual rhythm provides a dependable baseline. Royal ideology grows from that practical certainty. The king is not merely a ruler among others. He is the guarantor of Mut, the ordered condition of the world itself. If the river rises as it should, the fields answer. If the fields answer, the kingdom stands confirmed. Under such conditions, monument building becomes more than display. It is a declaration that order is durable enough to be fixed in stone. Pyramid complexes, mortuary temples, elite tombs, administrative centres, and the networks of labour that support them all express the same deeper assumption Egypt possesses the surplus, the discipline, and the divine favour to outlast ordinary time. The labour force can be summoned, food can be supplied, quarries can be worked, stone can be moved. Specialists can be fed while producing things that do not directly grow food at all. These are the privileges of a civilization deeply confident in its agricultural foundation. Yet confidence of this kind can be dangerous. because it encourages the belief that the system is self-sustaining when it is in fact still dependent on the river behaving within expected bounds. What survives from the end of the Old Kingdom suggests that those bounds begin to fail. The exact chronology and severity remain debated, and Egypt's political transformation cannot be reduced to one cause alone. Royal succession issues, the growing power of provincial elites, administrative decentralization, and fiscal strain all play their part. Even so, the environmental signal is difficult to ignore. There is substantial reason to suspect that a series of low Nile floods undermines the agricultural base on which royal authority depends. In a land where abundance is tied so tightly to inundation, repeated weakness in the flood does not remain a technical problem for farmers. It becomes a constitutional crisis written in mud and grain. The state feels this first in its margins, then in its structure. If the flood is poor, the harvest is poor. If the harvest is poor, revenues weaken. If revenues weaken, the centre's capacity to reward officials, maintain projects, and command loyalty narrows. In good times, provincial governors and local elites can serve as extensions of royal order. In difficult times, they become power centres in their own right, because people need immediate protection and provisioning more than distant ideology. This is one of the quiet shifts that often marks early collapse. The local becomes more real than the central. Authority does not vanish. It becomes less evenly distributed and less effortlessly believed. There is an irony here. The very success of Old Kingdom administration may help create the conditions for fragmentation. Over time, provincial officials accumulate resources, prestige, and local rootedness. When the centre is strong, this strengthens the kingdom. When the centre weakens, it gives the provinces the means to act more independently. Local tombs grow grander. Regional identities sharpen. Patronage and practical support flow through different channels. Scholars still debate how sudden or severe this transition is in different areas, but the broad movement is clear. Egypt becomes less like a perfectly unified sacred machine and more like a landscape of overlapping authorities negotiating survival under worsening conditions. The literary memory of this age, preserved in texts composed later or shaped by later reflection, is among the most haunting in the ancient world. Works often grouped under the broad atmosphere of lament, disorder, or social inversion describe a kingdom turned strange hunger, overturned hierarchy, insecurity, and moral dislocation. These texts cannot be treated as literal documentary transcripts of specific events. They are stylized, rhetorical, and deeply shaped by literary convention. Yet their emotional power matters. They remember crisis not only as political change, but as a felt inversion of normal life. The poor are where the rich once stood. The old certainties of rank and provision have broken. The land itself seems to accuse its rulers. Even if the details are transformed by genre, what survives in the record suggests that later, Egyptians understood the end of Old Kingdom stability as something profoundly unsettling, not merely administrative. One lesser-known but revealing feature of Egypt's weakening is that monumentality itself begins to tell a different story. The great age of pyramid building does not continue at the same scale or with the same effortless confidence. Resources, labour mobilization, and the political message embedded in such works all change. Stone still endures, but the conditions that once made those undertakings feel natural are no longer guaranteed. The contrast is striking. Huge structures remain on the landscape, visible proof of what centralized abundance had once made possible. while the political world that produced them grows less able to command the same coherence. The monuments survive the moment that justified them. For ordinary Egyptians, however, collapse is not experienced as a theory of decentralization. It is felt in food, security, and dependence. The evidence remains uneven because the poor rarely leave records in their own voice, but the broad implications are plain enough. A weak Nile means reduced harvests. Reduced harvests mean tighter granaries, more pressure from collectors, less room for generosity, and greater vulnerability to disease and displacement. The village that once trusted the wider rhythm of river and state must rely more on local arrangements, kinship, patronage, and improvisation. Where those fail, desperation follows. The great ideological elegance of Egyptian kingship does not feed anyone by itself. The river must still rise. And when the river disappoints, royal divinity becomes harder to inhabit convincingly. This is one of the deepest wounds of environmental crisis in Egypt. In Mesopotamia, kings rule amid a tradition already familiar with competition and urban rivalry. In Egypt, the king's role is more profoundly fused with cosmic maintenance. Repeated failure in the flood therefore strikes not just the treasury, but the theological imagination of the state. If the ruler maintains Mut, why does abundance falter? Ancient societies do not frame this question in modern secular language, but they feel its force all the same. Ritual may intensify. Appeals to the gods may become more urgent, but ritual cannot refill a deficient inundation. The ideology of order begins to echo against material shortage. There is also the problem of memory. Once a kingdom has lived through long prosperity, its people and institutions are calibrated to that expectation. Administrative demands reflect older norms. Elite lifestyles assume continued surplus. Temple endowments and mortuary cults require ongoing support. The system carries its own past forward as obligation. In bad years, that inheritance becomes a burden. Too many mouths are attached to yesterday's abundance. Too much prestige is linked to maintaining appearances. Too many officials are trained to preserve the image of continuity rather than to manage contraction honestly. This makes adaptation more painful, because the state is not merely fighting scarcity, it is fighting the habits of former success. What follows is not a simple disappearance of Egyptian civilization, and that distinction matters. Egypt does not vanish. The land remains inhabited, productive in parts, and culturally continuous. But the old shape of power weakens into what later historians call the First Intermediate Period, a time of fragmentation, regional assertion, and reconfigured authority. Some areas may have suffered badly, others perhaps weathered the change with more resilience. The evidence is not uniform, and no single explanation captures the whole human landscape. Yet the central fact remains. One of the ancient world's most confident kingdoms enters a prolonged phase in which royal centralization is no longer assured, and the old promise of effortless order cannot be maintained. There is a strange poignancy in imagining Egypt at this threshold. The pyramids still catch the light, the river still runs between its banks, priests still perform rites, officials still write in the old forms, villages still sow what they can. Nothing in the visible frame of the land announces that an age has ended, and yet the old unity is already becoming memory. The confidence that raised stone mountains out of the floodplain begins to thin into local negotiation, anxious subsistence, and competing claims to legitimacy. The kingdom has not been conquered into this condition. It has been worn into it by a combination of ecological stress and internal fragility. That is what makes Egypt's long shadow so important in the wider story of 2200 BC. It shows that collapse in the ancient world is not only the fate of aggressive empires stretched over difficult frontiers, it can also reach a civilization that appears internally harmonious, richly supplied by nature and supported by one of the most powerful political theologies ever devised. The Nile, so often the giver of order, becomes the medium through which uncertainty enters the kingdom. Once that uncertainty settles in, every older assumption begins to tremble. And beyond Egypt, the silence spreads further. Other regions, less clearly documented but no less important, are also changing under the pressure of the age. Some leave fewer inscriptions and fewer royal boasts. Their stories survive in altered cities, thinning settlements, and clues that are harder to read. The map of collapse grows wider, even where the record grows quiet. Beyond the best-known courts and dynasties, the ancient world begins to fall quiet in ways that are harder to narrate and, in some ways, more haunting. Egypt leaves pyramids and royal names. Mesopotamia leaves tablets, inscriptions, and literary memory. But many of the regions touched by the broader crisis around 2200 BC speak to later centuries in a softer voice. Their evidence survives in changed settlement plans, interrupted exchange, abandoned quarters, altered craft traditions, and silences where older patterns of activity ought to continue. This is one of the difficulties of reconstructing a world-scale transformation in deep antiquity. The farther one moves from the great literate states, the more the story depends on broken material traces rather than explicit testimony. And yet those traces matter, because they suggest that the age of instability reaches well beyond the capitals that usually dominate history. To the east, the Indus world stands as one of the most impressive and still partly elusive civilizations of the 3rd millennium BC. Its cities are planned with a discipline that remains startling. Even now, streets laid out in ordered grids, drainage systems integrated into urban life, standardized weights suggesting careful regulation of exchange, and settlements linked across a vast region from river valleys to coastal zones. Unlike Egypt and Mesopotamia, however, the Indus civilization leaves no widely deciphered historical inscriptions to explain itself. Its script remains unread, its rulers, if it had kings in forms familiar to its Western neighbours, remain strangely anonymous. This means that when change comes, scholars must infer it through archaeology alone. The result is both frustrating and revealing. The evidence suggests transformation, contraction, and reorganization over time, but the precise causes and rhythms remain debated. What survives in the record indicates that by the late 3rd millennium and into the early 2nd millennium BC, many large Indus urban centres begin to change. Some contract, some are abandoned or reduced in scale. Patterns of craft production shift. Long-distance trade with Mesopotamia weakens. Settlement appears to move in certain regions towards smaller communities and different ecological zones. Scholars still debate how tightly this process aligns with the 2200 BC climate event and how abrupt or gradual the changes truly are. No single explanation fully accounts for the transition. River shifts, changing monsoons, local ecological pressures, economic reorganization, and internal social transformation may all have mattered. What seems clear is that one of the great urban worlds of the Bronze Age does not continue unchanged. The silence of its script means we do not hear it describe its own distress, but the cities themselves suggest that old forms of concentration are becoming harder to sustain. A lesser-known but important clue in the Indus story lies in water not merely as supply, but as geography. River systems can migrate, branch, fail, or become less dependable over time. in a civilization spread across a broad and environmentally varied region, such changes matter enormously. A settlement pattern that makes sense under one hydrological regime may become far less viable under another. If monsoon behavior shifts, if channels alter, if some areas become drier while others remain more favorable, then the map of urban life begins to reorganize. This is one reason collapse need not always look like a dramatic final destruction. It may look instead like populations choosing, or being forced, to live differently. Large cities become less central. Regional patterns replace integrated urban concentration. The civilization continues in altered form even as the age of its great cities fades. Farther west, along the eastern Mediterranean and in parts of Anatolia and the Levant, the evidence for disruption around this broad period also appears in uneven ways. Some sites show contraction, destruction, abandonment, or changing occupation. Others continue with adaptation or local resilience. The record is patchy, and scholars remain cautious about forcing all these changes into a single, synchronized narrative. That caution is wise. The ancient world is not a machine in which one lever is pulled and every region responds identically. Still, what survives in these quieter zones suggests a landscape under pressure. Trade links shift, settlement hierarchies change. Some communities become more defensible or more localized. In places where earlier growth depended on exchange and stable ecological margins, the broader age of instability leaves marks that are difficult to ignore. Maritime connections, too, seem to weaken in some directions. This matters because long-distance exchange is often the first thing to appear magnificent in prosperous times, and one of the first things to contract under stress. Imported prestige goods become rarer. Craft traditions dependent on distant raw materials may shrink or alter. Ports or coastal nodes that once participated in wider circuits find themselves tied to thinner networks. For elites, this is a loss of distinction and influence. For ordinary craftspeople and labourers, it may mean the disappearance of familiar work. The glittering surface of interregional connection fades first at the edges, then in the centre. Later, archaeologists see it in missing materials and broken patterns. The people living through it experience it as a narrowing of the world. One of the strange things about this broader silence is that it can tempt the imagination toward exaggeration. Because the evidence is incomplete, fringe theories rush in where the record grows thin. People begin to speak of universal apocalypse, vanished super-civilizations, or mysterious singular events that supposedly explain every regional change at once. But the real story, as far as mainstream archaeology and environmental history can tell, is both more complicated and more human. There is no need to invent lost technologies or supernatural shocks. The combination of climatic stress, shifting rivers, weakened trade, internal fragility, migration, and changing social priorities is enough to transform whole worlds. The evidence remains incomplete. Yes, but incomplete does not mean empty. It means careful interpretation is required. This is especially true in the eastern Mediterranean, where local trajectories vary enormously. Some communities suffer destruction, others simply shrink or reorient. A coastal town may decline because exchange routes have grown less reliable. An inland settlement may become more important because it sits nearer dependable water or defensible terrain. A region that once prospered from connecting larger powers may suffer when those powers weaken. In this sense, silence itself becomes historical evidence. When the great states at the centre of interregional systems begin to falter, the quieter places connected to them often lose visibility at the same time, not because nothing is happening, but because the structures that once amplified their importance are thinning away. There is also the issue of chronology, which scholars continue to wrestle with. Deep antiquity does not always yield exact dates cleanly. Regional chronologies must be aligned through pottery sequences, radiocarbon, stratigraphy, trade goods, inscriptions, and environmental proxies, all of which have their own margins of uncertainty. This means that the phrase around 2200 BC is best understood as a zone of transformation, rather than a single calendar year in which every society suddenly changes. Some areas begin to strain earlier, others unravel later. Some may experience severe disruption, others more measured transition. But that broad zone still matters, because across it one sees multiple civilizations and regional systems confronting converging pressures at roughly the same historical horizon. That is what gives the period its unusual gravity. Imagine the map of the old world as it might have looked to no one in particular, because no one alive then could have seen it whole. In one place a court still functions, though more nervously. In another, a city quarter empties. In another, a river shifts enough to make old streets less useful. In another, merchants stop arriving as often. Elsewhere, a smaller settlement absorbs people from a declining urban centre. The process is not tidy. It unfolds as countless local decisions shaped by hunger, fear, opportunity, memory, and environmental change. Yet when these local stories are laid side by side, a broader picture emerges. The age of high third millennium confidence is ending across a surprisingly wide arc of territory. What survives in the record suggests that this end is not total erasure. That point matters deeply. The Indus civilization does not simply vanish into myth. People remain, traditions persist, crafts evolve, and regional cultures continue. Eastern Mediterranean communities do not all collapse into emptiness. Some endure, adapt, and form the groundwork of later societies. Even in the most affected zones, the ancient world is not emptied of humans. It is repatterned. The silence is therefore not the silence of extinction, but of lost complexity. The big cities speak less loudly. The integrated worlds become more local. Administrative order gives way to narrower scales of life. That is a more unsettling kind of loss in some ways, because it is not theatrical. It is the disappearance of density, confidence, and connection. A city can still stand partly inhabited. A trade route can still exist but matter less. A civilization can survive culturally while losing the structures that once made it feel expansive and secure. Archaeology is good at recovering destruction by fire. It is less dramatic but equally revealing when it recovers gradual thinning. Around 2200 BC and the centuries close to it, thinning becomes part of the story in region after region. The great capitals do not notice this wider silence all at once. They remain preoccupied with their own crises, their own floods, frontiers, and failed harvests. But history, from a long distance, can see something they cannot. The problems are no longer isolated to one empire's misfortune or one kingdom's weak river. They form a broader age of contraction stretching from well-documented centres into quieter lands where the clues are harder to read, but the change is still real. The ancient world is losing not only power, but breadth. And when breadth is lost, people begin to move. Empty granaries, weakened states, and shrinking viable landscapes do not remain still. They push populations across boundaries, into rival territories, toward riverbanks, city walls, and pasture edges already under strain. The silence over distant lands is about to be broken by footsteps. When food grows scarce and the old systems lose their grip, people move. They do not move in neat historical categories. They move because the field no longer answers, because the animals need grazing, because tax demands continue after the harvest has failed, because the road behind them feels emptier than the road ahead, because rumour says another district still has water, because a city wall seems safer than an open village, because kin live somewhere farther downstream, because staying has begun to look more dangerous than leaving. Migration is one of the most human responses to environmental and political stress, yet settled states almost always experience it first as threat. A hungry family arriving from a failing zone does not look, to an anxious administrator, like climate history in motion. It looks like pressure. By this stage of the ancient crisis, the granaries that once steadied society are becoming symbols of everything that is now in question. Grain has always been more than food. It is stored labour, political leverage, ritual security, and the promise that the next season can be reached without panic. When the granaries thin, the fear they produce is not only nutritional, it is social. A state that cannot provision itself convincingly begins to lose the right to expect easy obedience. A town that cannot protect its own stores becomes suspicious of strangers. A village watching its reserves decline becomes less charitable, less patient, and more likely to defend what remains with violence. Scarcity changes moral boundaries, it shrinks the circle of obligation. This is where movement and conflict begin feeding each other. In drylands and marginal zones, herders under pressure from failing pasture push toward river valleys, better watered districts, or the edges of cultivated land. In farming regions, families facing repeated poor yields drift toward stronger settlements, administrative centres, or areas rumoured to be less badly affected. Some arrive peacefully seeking work, exchange, or refuge. Others come armed, either because they have always moved with weapons or because hunger has stripped away the luxury of appearing harmless. The line between raiding and migration grows difficult to maintain in the historical record, and probably in lived reality as well. A group may move in search of subsistence one season and seize by force the next when access is denied. States, meanwhile, respond with the language they know best: suppression, fortification, extraction, and blame. In Mesopotamian tradition, this pattern is often flattened into stories of hostile outsiders descending upon civilized lands. The Gutians are the most famous example in connection with the decline of Akkad, remembered in later texts as coarse intruders from the highlands who overrun the ordered lowlands. Such portrayals reveal more than simple ethnic hostility. They expose the fear of a settled world confronted by movement it can no longer regulate, yet the evidence remains incomplete. And scholars still debate how large a role such groups played, how they were perceived in real time, and how much later literary tradition exaggerated their destructiveness. What seems more certain is that mobile peoples become more consequential when states weaken. Frontier groups do not need to become suddenly more powerful on their own. They only need a world in which the old defensive systems are no longer fully functioning. This broader instability also changes the meaning of the countryside. In prosperous times, the countryside is what feeds the city. In crisis, it can become what the city fears losing control over. Roads are less secure. Outlying settlements are harder to protect. Grain convoys require escorts. Tax collectors move under greater risk. A single raid on a caravan or storage site does not ruin a kingdom, but repeated insecurity makes transport costlier and trust thinner. The city wall begins to matter differently. It is no longer just a statement of urban confidence. It becomes a line between those who still have stores and those who may try to take them. A lesser-known but deeply revealing feature of collapse is that empty granaries do not simply signal hunger. They also expose the fiction of endless central power. A ruler may continue proclaiming victory, but if rations fail to reach soldiers or labourers, the substance of command begins to evaporate. Armies can still fight briefly on reputation, but not for long without supply. Officials may still collect, but collection turns increasingly predatory if there is no genuine surplus left to circulate back into the system. Temples may still perform ritual, but offerings shrink when the agricultural base contracts. Even the most sacred institutions are dragged towards scarcity because scarcity touches the entire chain of dependence. In that sense, the empty granary is more dangerous than the enemy at the gate. The enemy threatens from outside. The empty granary reveals that the centre is already weakening from within. In Egypt, similar dynamics likely take a somewhat different form. The Nile Valley channels movement more narrowly than the open ecologies of Mesopotamia and its surrounding zones. But repeated low floods and weakening central authority still create the conditions for local insecurity, competition over resources, and stronger provincial autonomy. The record does not hand us a simple sequence of mass migrations and raids in the dramatic style of later periods, but it does suggest a kingdom becoming harder to govern uniformly. Local officials and regional power holders matter more because they are closer to the practical business of survival. If food is short, if transport is uncertain, if central command no longer guarantees relief, then people look first to those who can actually help. That is another form of political migration. Even when bodies do not move far, loyalty shifts toward the nearest effective source of order. The human consequences are harshest in the middle ground between total collapse and total survival. Communities that are not fully destroyed may still become trapped in cycles of fear. A settlement absorbs newcomers, but not enough food comes with them. Local fields are already underperforming. Tension rises. One household accuses another of withholding grain. Debt arrangements break down. Theft increases, defences are repaired, the next caravan fails to arrive, or arrives with less than expected. A local leader promises protection in exchange for heavier obligations. The old state remains visible somewhere in the background, but daily life is governed more and more by negotiation under stress. This is how civilizations fracture socially before they disappear politically. What survives in archaeology often reflects this process in indirect ways. Fortification changes, settlement shifts toward more defensible locations, abandonment of exposed rural sites, concentration in nodes with better water or protection, and interruptions in trade that leave communities more dependent on local resources. Scholars still debate the meaning of some of these patterns in particular regions, and no single model fits the whole ancient world. Yet the broader theme is hard to avoid. Scarcity and mobility work together. People move because systems are failing, and their movement places additional pressure on the systems that remain. The result is a feedback loop of instability. A state weakened by drought faces migration and raiding. Migration and raiding make it harder to manage drought. There is also a moral dimension that later elite texts only partly capture. Ancient literature often remembers such moments by emphasizing disorder, lawlessness, and the overturning of proper hierarchy. But beneath that elite anxiety lies a simpler reality. Many of the people on the move are not enemies in any grand ideological sense. They are survivors. They are trying to cross the narrowing bridge between one season and the next. Some become violent because there is no non-violent path left open to them. Others are made into threats by settled authorities that cannot distinguish between need and invasion. Collapse turns ordinary human movement into a political crisis because the room for generosity has disappeared. Once granaries grow unreliable, the state's relationship with violence changes as well. Force becomes more frequent, more visible, and less effective. Troops can disperse raiders, punish disobedient districts, or secure a route for a time, but they cannot restore rainfall, refill exhausted storehouses, or make abandoned land productive again. This is one reason collapsing systems often appear both brutal and weak. They strike harder because they have fewer other tools. They also achieve less with each act of force because the underlying problem is not merely political. Every punitive expedition, every confiscation, every fortified depot is a sign that ordinary flows of food and compliance have broken down. The more force is needed to maintain order, the clearer it becomes that order has already thinned. And so the human map of the ancient world begins to blur. Families leave marginal lands. Herders push into cultivated zones. Cities take in some and repel others. Frontier peoples become more visible because settled states have grown less capable of managing them quietly. Trade routes acquire a reputation for danger. The distance between rural desperation and political collapse narrows sharply. A civilization that once seemed held together by rivers, roads, and record-keeping now discovers how quickly those same networks can become channels for fear. By now, the crisis can no longer be described only through kings and climate. It lives in the movement of bodies across the land, in the guarded door of a grain store, in the road watched from behind a wall, in the official who no longer trusts the figures he receives, in the family that leaves at dusk carrying what it can. The ancient world is being reorganized by hunger. Some groups will survive by mobility, others by fortification, others by lowering the scale of life and expectation. But the integrated systems of the high third millennium are paying the price of having depended on abundance too deeply. Soon the ruins themselves will begin to speak more clearly. Dust layers, abandoned settlements, broken trade links, altered burials, and the thinning of a written record will show what the crisis looked like on the ground. For now, though, the most immediate evidence is human movement under pressure, and the terrible fact that the granaries which once held civilization together are no longer full enough to keep the peace. What the ruins show is rarely the drama people expect. There is no single horizon line of ash stretching neatly from Egypt to Mesopotamia, no universal layer of destruction marking the exact moment the ancient world breaks. Collapse, in archaeological terms, is usually quieter and more difficult than that. It appears as absence where density once existed, as interruption where continuity should have continued, as changed habits of burial, storage, building, and movement. The ruins do not announce the cause in plain language, they preserve the consequences, and around the broad crisis of 2200 BC, those consequences begin to accumulate in ways too consistent to ignore. One of the clearest signs is abandonment, though even that word can mislead if it is imagined too absolutely. A settlement may not be deserted forever to count as abandoned in the history of collapse. It may simply cease to be inhabited at the scale or in the form it once sustained. Neighborhoods empty, public buildings fall out of repair, storage areas stop being replenished, streets once kept open by daily traffic begin to fill with drifted debris and wind-blown dust. A place that had been dense with routine becomes patchy, quieter, thinner. Archaeology is very good at detecting this thinning. It sees fewer occupation layers, less rebuilding, reduced quantities of imported goods, changes in domestic architecture, or long pauses where activity should have left richer traces. This is how the material world records the shrinking of confidence. In parts of northern Mesopotamia and Syria, scholars have pointed to settlement contraction and signs of aridification that align broadly with the age of crisis. Some zones that had supported significant occupation appear to lose density or be abandoned, especially where agriculture depended on rainfall close to ecological thresholds. Dust deposits in certain areas have been read as evidence of increasing dryness and landscape degradation. The evidence remains incomplete and site-specific, and responsible historians are careful not to turn every layer of decline into a single grand explanation. Still, what survives in the ground suggests real disruption. Towns and villages once tied into wider political and agricultural systems become harder to maintain. The landscape itself begins preserving the story in silence and sediment. Farther south, the evidence may not always appear as total abandonment so much as altered intensity. Cities can continue while losing the breadth of activity that once made them powerful. Administrative quarters persist, but with thinner archives. Workshops continue, but with less imported material. Houses remain occupied, though perhaps by fewer people or under poorer conditions. This matters because it reminds us that collapse is not always extinction. It is often the reduction of complexity. The old system may leave enough behind to imply continuity, yet the scale, confidence, and integration have diminished. A kingdom can survive in outline while losing much of what once made it a kingdom in practice. Broken trade links are another part of this archaeological language. In prosperous times, distant materials arrive regularly enough that their presence becomes normal in elite and administrative contexts. Metal sources are tapped, stones, shells, woods, and crafted goods move over long routes. Pottery styles travel. Weight systems align. When interregional exchange weakens, the change appears in subtle but telling ways. Imported items become rarer. Local substitutes appear. Standardization loosens. Prestige goods no longer move with the same consistency. The glitter fades from the edges of power first. This is more than an elite inconvenience. It means the roads are less safe, the merchants less certain, the agreements less dependable, and the wider world less connected than before. Burial patterns can also reveal a crisis that texts barely describe. Changes in grave goods, body treatment, cemetery location, or the scale of funerary investment may indicate shifting social priorities and reduced surplus. In some places, the dead are buried with less elaborate provisioning than in earlier, more prosperous periods. In others, local burial customs change as communities become more mobile or more fragmented. The evidence is often difficult to interpret, because mortuary behaviour is shaped by belief as well as economy, and archaeology must be careful not to read every simpler grave as proof of universal impoverishment. Even so, when burial changes appear alongside settlement contraction and disrupted trade, they become part of a cumulative picture. The living are coping differently, and the dead reflect it. One of the most haunting clues in ancient collapse is the thinning of written record. We tend to think of history as becoming clearer when writing exists, but writing itself depends on institutions worth writing for. Archives need scribes, training, administrative demand, and confidence that records matter. When states fragment and economic life contracts, writing often becomes patchier. The silence of fewer tablets, fewer inscriptions, fewer routine accounts can therefore mean more than a mere documentary gap. It may indicate that the machinery of administration has been reduced, localized, or broken. In Mesopotamia, the weakening of imperial structures affects not just politics, but visibility itself. The world becomes harder to count, and later historians feel that loss as absence. A lesser-known but especially revealing sign of crisis is the failure of maintenance. Grand building projects are impressive, but maintenance is the real signature of stable civilization. Canals must be cleared, walls repaired, streets levelled, drainage kept open, roofs reworked, storage facilities renewed. None of this produces the dramatic glory of conquest inscriptions or monuments. Yet, it is the daily labour that keeps urban life possible. When maintenance falters, archaeology notices. Infrastructure silts up, buildings decay without proper rebuilding, water systems become less reliable, public spaces lose coherence. The world looks less governed not because it has been spectacularly destroyed, but because no one can any longer spare the labour or coordination to keep it functioning at the old level. This is particularly important because it helps distinguish between sudden conquest and deeper systemic decline. A city destroyed in war may burn brightly in the archaeological record. A city undone by thinning surplus and failing maintenance may leave less dramatic evidence. But in some ways it reveals more about the underlying fragility of the civilization. Around 2200 BC, many of the most important clues belong to this second category. There are destructions, to be sure, and local violence. But the wider story is not simply one of armies knocking down walls. It is of whole landscapes becoming harder to organize and support. The record also preserves contradiction, and that contradiction matters. Not every site declines at once. Not every region shows the same sequence. Some places may even grow in importance as others fail, benefiting from better water, stronger local leadership, or strategic position amid wider contraction. This unevenness is one reason scholars still debate the scope and synchronization of the collapse. The evidence remains incomplete, and archaeology is always vulnerable to overgeneralization when dramatic narratives are too eagerly imposed. Yet unevenness does not weaken the case for a major transformation. It simply reminds us that collapse is lived locally. A farmer in one district experiences abandonment. Another in a better watered zone experiences opportunity as displaced people arrive. A regional centre may rise precisely because the larger system is breaking apart. What the ruins ultimately show, then, is not a clean ending but a change in scale. The dense, interconnected, administratively visible world of the high third millennium becomes less dense, less connected, and less visible in many places. The map of habitation simplifies. The range of movement narrows for some and becomes more desperate for others. Long-distance certainty gives way to local improvisation. The architecture of order remains in fragments, but the habits that sustained it no longer run with the same force. There is something deeply human in this material record: a collapsed doorway, a neglected canal, a reduced grave, a storage jar left in a room that was never properly reoccupied. These are not abstractions. They are traces of households recalculating, of officials failing to hold a system together, of communities deciding whether to stay, leave, or rebuild smaller. The ruins do not lie, but they do require humility. They tell us that something large happened. While refusing to reduce that event to a single villain or moment, they preserve drought without naming it, violence without narrating it, and fear without ever recording the sound of a hungry conversation at dusk. That is why the evidence matters so much in this story. It keeps the mystery grounded. Around 2200 BC, we do not need to imagine a lost apocalyptic secret to explain the ancient world's distress. The ruins show enough. Settlements contract, dust accumulates, exchange weakens, infrastructure decays, burial and habitation patterns change, writing thins, administrative reach narrows. What survives in the record suggests a world under pressure severe enough to alter the shape of civilization itself. Even if every region reaches that point by a somewhat different path. And because the evidence is cumulative rather than theatrical, it leads naturally to the hardest conclusion of all. No single explanation is likely to be sufficient. Climate matters, war matters, migration matters, political fragility matters, local ecology matters. The ruins resist simplification because the collapse itself was made of overlapping stresses. The ancient world did not fail from one blow. It failed because too many blows landed close together on systems that had grown less flexible than they appeared. By the time the evidence is gathered from ruined settlements, weakened archives, altered burials, dust layers, and the memory of later texts, the temptation is always to ask for one decisive answer. What caused the collapse of the ancient world around 2200 BC? The question is understandable. Human beings prefer clean endings. A single cause makes history feel legible. If the answer is drought, then the story belongs to climate. If it is invasion, then the story belongs to war. If it is poor leadership, then the story becomes moral instruction. But the deeper one looks into this period, the harder that simplicity becomes to defend. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the scale, unevenness, and timing of what happened. What emerges instead is a puzzle in which several kinds of stress seem to collide with one another, until systems that once looked durable begin to fail. Climate is the most obvious candidate because it explains so much so elegantly. Across parts of the Near East and neighbouring regions, there is meaningful evidence for a broad episode of drying and environmental instability around the relevant centuries. Rain-fed agricultural zones appear to suffer. Dust increases in some areas. River behaviour shifts. The Nile may experience repeated low floods. Communities that depend on predictable water and seasonality find their margins shrinking. This is powerful explanatory material, and it has rightly shaped much modern understanding of the period. Without environmental stress, many of the political and social fractures might never have widened so dramatically. Climate, in that sense, does not merely accompany the collapse. It helps create the conditions under which other weaknesses become dangerous. And yet climate alone is not enough. Drought does not automatically destroy civilizations. People have always lived through difficult weather. Some communities adapt, relocate, reduce scale, diversify subsistence, or reorganize authority. A hard environment does not produce one inevitable outcome. It becomes catastrophic when it strikes societies already committed to structures that are inflexible, unequal, overextended, or ecologically strained. This is why political fragility must sit beside climate in any serious explanation. The great states of the late third millennium are not blank victims of nature. They are elaborate systems built around taxation, surplus extraction, labour mobilisation, and ideological claims of control. When the environmental foundation weakens, these systems are tested. Their ability to respond depends on how much reserve they possess, how adaptable their institutions are, and how willing their rulers are to adjust expectations. In many cases, the answer seems to have been not enough. Consider Akkad. Even if climate stress reduced agricultural reliability and increased pressure on frontier zones, the empire might still have endured had it been smaller, looser, or less dependent on wide territorial control. But it is none of those things. It is ambitious, extractive, and stretched across diverse regions with unequal loyalties. A state of that kind can thrive magnificently when resources are flowing, yet become brittle when they tighten. Political overextension therefore belongs at the centre of the story. Not overextension in the crude sense that empires always fall because they are large, but in the more exact sense that the cost of commanding the system eventually exceeds what the strained landscape can pay. Climate turns the screw, but imperial form determines how much pressure the system can survive. Egypt presents the same lesson in a different key. Low Nile floods may help explain agricultural weakness and the erosion of confidence in royal provision. But Old Kingdom Egypt is also vulnerable because of its internal structure. Provincial elites have grown stronger. Administration has become more layered. Royal ideology is deeply tied to the visible performance of order. When the river fails to provide its usual reassurance, political fragmentation becomes more likely not simply because there is less grain, but because there are already alternative centres of practical authority waiting beneath the surface. Climate weakens the centre. Internal political evolution determines how that weakness is distributed. War and violence, too, have to be counted, though carefully. Ancient texts often prefer to blame enemies because enemies are narratively satisfying. They give collapse a face. The Gutians in Mesopotamian tradition are the clearest example, yet warfare is rarely the sole cause of systemic failure in such periods. Instead, violence acts as an accelerant. A weakened state is more vulnerable to raids, rebellions, and frontier incursions. A hungry population is harder to govern peacefully. A less reliable road network increases the military cost of maintaining order. Once conflict intensifies, it further damages production, movement, and trust. Fields go untilled. Storehouses are emptied or seized. Labour is redirected from maintenance to defence. In this sense, war is both cause and consequence. It grows out of instability and then deepens it. Migration belongs in the same category of double effect. People move because conditions worsen, and their movement creates new pressure where they arrive. Mobile groups become more visible along the edges of cultivated lands. Settled communities become more defensive. Administrators interpret displaced populations as threat rather than symptom. This does not mean migration causes collapse in the simplistic sense often preferred by frightened elites or later storytellers. It means that in a world already suffering environmental and political stress, movement redistributes crisis across the map. One district's failure becomes another district's burden. One frontier's pressure becomes one capital's administrative emergency. There are also slower and less dramatic explanations that deserve attention precisely because they are easy to overlook. Soil exhaustion, salinization in irrigated landscapes, deforestation in some local contexts, or long-term overuse of marginal land may not by themselves bring down a civilization, but they reduce resilience. They are the historical equivalent of an unseen fever weakening the body before a larger illness arrives. In parts of Mesopotamia, agricultural stress associated with irrigation practices may have made some zones less productive over time. In other regions, dependence on ecological thresholds, especially for rain-fed farming, meant that even moderate shifts in climate could have outsized effects. These structural ecological vulnerabilities matter because they help explain why some societies are hit so hard when broader conditions worsen. The crisis is not landing on untouched landscapes. It is landing on landscapes already worked intensely for generations. One lesser-known but crucial explanation is administrative rigidity. States are often praised for order, but order can become a trap when conditions change quickly. An administration built to collect expected quotas may continue demanding them after the land can no longer supply them. A king whose legitimacy depends on appearing infallible may delay adaptation because acknowledgement of crisis feels politically dangerous. Officials may conceal bad news, distort figures, or protect their own status rather than communicate the scale of failure. In this way, bureaucracy can preserve normal procedures long past the point where normality has ended. Collapse is then worsened not because institutions are absent, but because they continue performing the wrong script. Disease is sometimes proposed as part of the picture, and it remains possible that famine, displacement, and weakened bodies made epidemics more likely, as they often do in stressed societies. But here the evidence is thinner. Unlike climate signals or settlement shifts, disease is hard to detect clearly in deep antiquity unless mass mortality leaves distinct traces, and such traces are often ambiguous. Scholars still debate how much weight to assign epidemic disease in this period, and caution is wise. It may have contributed to local suffering, it may have amplified the consequences of malnutrition and movement, but it does not currently stand as the primary explanatory pillar in the way climate, political fragility, and economic contraction do. The most convincing interpretation, then, is not a contest between explanations but an interaction among them. Drought reduces yields. Reduced yields weaken states. Weakened states struggle to manage migration and frontier pressure. Conflict disrupts transport and labour. Administrative rigidity increases suffering. Local ecological degradation lowers resilience further. Trade contracts, making recovery harder. Each pressure intensifies the others. This is why the collapse feels so total in retrospect. Not because one force is all-powerful, but because many forces converge on systems that have lost the flexibility to absorb them. There is something sobering in that conclusion. It denies the comfort of blaming only nature or only bad rulers or only hostile outsiders. The ancient world around 2200 BC appears to have been undone by a tangled crisis in which environment and human organization became inseparable. The rain failed, but so did institutions. Rivers behaved unpredictably, but so did political loyalties. The land grew less generous, and the states built upon it discovered that they had mistaken successful management for permanent security. Scholars still debate the proportions, the timing, and the local sequence. They disagree over how synchronous the transformations truly are and over which regions should be grouped most closely together. Those debates are healthy. They keep the history honest, but they do not erase the larger pattern. A major civilizational contraction took place, and it was made not by one cause, but by too many causes arriving together. That is also why the story remains so compelling. A puzzle with no single cause feels more like real life than the old tales of punishment or sudden doom. Human societies are rarely destroyed by one thing alone. They are brought low when several manageable problems stop being manageable at the same time. Around 2200 BC, that appears to be exactly what happened. The ancient world did not simply encounter drought, or rebellion, or migration, or bad rulers. It encountered all of them in combination severe enough to overwhelm the systems built to contain them. And yet the story does not end with failure alone. Once the larger structures break, people begin the quieter, more difficult work of surviving after grandeur. The age of great integrated kingdoms gives way, in many places, to something smaller, rougher, and more local. The next stage of the story is not the death of civilization, but its reassembly in diminished forms. After the larger systems begin to fail, survival no longer belongs to those who can imagine the widest world. It belongs to those who can live within a smaller one. This is one of the most important truths hidden inside ancient collapse. the fall of empires and the weakening of kingdoms look, from a distance, like endings. For the people inside them, they are also instructions. The old scale no longer works. The granaries are too thin, the roads too uncertain, the demands from the centre too heavy or too meaningless to sustain. So communities begin to do what human communities have always done when great structures break above them. They narrow the circle, reduce the load, adapt to what remains, and rebuild life closer to the ground. That rebuilding is rarely glorious. It does not leave behind the kind of evidence that later ages are most eager to celebrate. There are fewer monuments, fewer royal boasts, fewer impressive archives, fewer goods moving from distant lands, but there is resilience in it all the same. A village that survives by shifting to a less ambitious agricultural pattern, by relying more heavily on local water sources, or by moving to higher, safer, or more dependable ground, is participating in one of the oldest forms of political intelligence, the refusal to remain organized around conditions that no longer exist. What disappears after 2200 BC in many regions is not human capacity, but a certain scale of complexity. The world grows smaller so that life can continue. In Mesopotamia and its surrounding zones, what follows the weakening of imperial integration is not pure emptiness but regionalization. Some cities recover or persist under altered political arrangements. Local dynasties, smaller centres, and shifting coalitions become more important. The broad imperial frame that once claimed to hold many landscapes together gives way to a more fragmented political mosaic. This is not necessarily a sign of backwardness. In a stressed world, fragmentation can be adaptive. Smaller powers may govern more honestly because they can only claim what they can actually reach. Their horizons are narrower, but their obligations are also less inflated by imperial ambition. A modest polity can sometimes survive where a great empire fails, simply because it asks less of land and people at the same time. Agriculture itself likely changes in this direction as well. Where possible, communities diversify. They lean on mixed strategies, combining cultivation with herding, fishing, gathering, or local exchange. They may favour crops or techniques better suited to reduced moisture or uncertain yields. In places where old irrigation systems become too costly to maintain at scale, cultivation contracts or reorganises around more manageable patterns. In regions once integrated by long-distance trade, people rely more heavily on nearby materials, nearby labour, nearby authority. It is not a dramatic technological revolution. It is something more modest and, in many ways, more impressive a civilizational exhalation after overreach. One lesser known but revealing aspect of post-collapse survival is that simpler systems can sometimes be more resilient precisely because they have fewer points of failure. A small community depending on local networks may suffer terribly from drought, but it is not also trying to provision distant garrisons, finance monumental projects, maintain imperial roads, and satisfy a vast administrative hierarchy. Its losses are direct and painful, yet its structure is less top-heavy. This does not romanticize smallness. Small communities can be fragile, violent, and desperate. But it does explain why the disassembly of the larger states does not always lead to total ruin. Sometimes it creates the only conditions under which enduring life remains possible. Egypt's path after Old Kingdom centralization weakens follows this same logic in its own way. During the first intermediate period, power becomes more regional, more dependent on local rulers and provincial strengths. Later Egyptian tradition often remembers this as disorder, and from the perspective of royal central ideology it certainly is. Yet such memory can obscure the practical truth that local governance may have been what allowed many communities to endure. When the centre no longer guarantees stability, people turn to those closest to the sources of grain, protection, and arbitration. Local tomb inscriptions from later periods sometimes emphasize a ruler's provisioning role in times of distress, presenting him as the one who fed the hungry and kept the district alive. Such claims are self-serving, of course, but they still reveal what people had come to value most. In an age of contraction, legitimacy belongs to those who can keep others fed. The urban world changes with this shift. Some cities remain important, but the great confidence of urban concentration is weakened. Populations may disperse into smaller settlements, or cluster in more defensible and ecologically reliable zones. Large public or ceremonial spaces matter less than access to water, cultivable land, and practical security. The built environment reflects this change. Investment moves away from grand statements and toward the maintenance of whatever directly supports life. Even when elites still seek prestige, they do so in a world that is no longer convinced by scale alone. A king can claim divine favor. A local strongman who actually distributes grain may seem more real. Trade also becomes narrower, though not absent. Exchange continues, but over shorter distances and with fewer luxuries. The disappearance of some imported materials from the archaeological record is often interpreted as decline, and in terms of long-distance integration it certainly is. But it can also signal a reorientation of values. Communities stripped of surplus do not stop living because prestige goods vanish. They live differently. Local production, local substitutes, and practical tools become more important than participation in far-flung systems of elite display. The horizon of aspiration contracts, and with it the vulnerability tied to those longer networks. There is a psychological change here too, though archaeology only reveals it indirectly. A society accustomed to large political narratives must slowly learn to inhabit smaller certainties instead of empire, district, instead of grand flood confidence, careful storage. Instead of the assumption that next year will resemble the last great decade, a harder acceptance that every season must be negotiated on its own terms. Children born into this more localized world would not necessarily experience it as catastrophic. They would simply grow up inside different expectations. What later historians call collapse is, for many of them, the baseline from which all ordinary life proceeds. Scholars still debate how much continuity survived beneath these smaller worlds, and the answer varies by region. Cultural traditions persist. Religious life adapts rather than vanishes. Administrative knowledge does not disappear entirely. It may be preserved in thinner, more local forms. Technologies of farming, craft, and writing continue in places, though often with reduced scale. This is another reason ancient collapse should never be mistaken for civilizational amnesia. Knowledge survives, but the structures required to deploy it grandly do not. The memory of a larger world remains, sometimes painfully, as a contrast to present limits. And yet these smaller worlds are not merely waiting rooms before recovery. They are creative in their own right. New political forms emerge, alliances shift, local elites build legitimacy differently. Communities discover which parts of old civilization were essential and which were luxuries of abundance. This sorting process matters. It is how later recoveries become possible. A society that has shrunk under pressure can, over time, begin expanding again, but often on different terms. The collapse around 2200 BC is therefore not only an ending, it is also an education in limits. The survivors do not simply inherit ruins, they inherit lessons written in drought, hunger, broken roads, and the failure of over-centralized power. There is something deeply moving in that endurance. The ancient world loses much, but it does not lose the human ability to reorganize meaning under harsher skies. People still marry, plant, bury, bargain, worship, and remember. They still tell children where the better water lies and which fields once belonged to those who are gone. They still patch walls, reshape routes, and make a life from narrower means. The empires fall. The local world persists. That persistence is the bridge to everything that comes after. If the collapse had been absolute, there would be nothing to rebuild from. Instead, what survives is enough memory, enough practice, enough people, enough grain, enough order in diminished form. From these smaller worlds, later societies will rise, carrying with them both the scars of crisis and the habits learned in response to it. In the centuries ahead, some regions will centralize again, kingdoms will reassert themselves, and the old language of grandeur will return, but it will return to landscapes that have already learned a hard lesson about how quickly grandeur can fail. And because people remember such lessons, even imperfectly, collapse does not vanish when the crisis ends. It lingers in story, in political caution, in local pride, in the way later generations imagine the age before their own. The world has been made smaller, but memory has been made deeper. From that depth will come not only recovery, but myth. Long after the storehouses are refilled and new rulers begin claiming that order has returned, the memory of collapse continues to move through the ancient world in altered forms. Civilizations rarely remember their worst disruptions plainly. The facts are too painful, too politically inconvenient, too tangled to preserve without reshaping. Instead, they survive as laments, moral lessons, dynastic propaganda, local pride, warnings about hubris, or stories in which the gods withdraw favor and then, eventually, restore it. The result is that later generations do not merely inherit the consequences of the crisis around 2200 BC, they inherit its emotional afterimage. In Mesopotamia, one of the most striking examples is the literary memory of Akkad's fall. The curse of Agad, though composed later and shaped by theological imagination, offers something more valuable than literal reportage. It preserves a civilization's attempt to make sense of why a mighty imperial center could fail so completely. In the poem, collapse is not explained through logistics, rainfall patterns, and administrative overstretch. Even if those may have mattered profoundly in historical reality, it is explained through divine anger, cosmic disruption, and the reversal of abundance. The fields no longer yield, the waterways fail in their promise, prosperity turns into deprivation. The city that once gathered power becomes a place abandoned by favor. This is not neutral history, but it is truthful in another sense. It captures the feeling that collapse leaves behind not simply defeat, but a rupture in the order of the world. That distinction matters because memory is never just a storage chest for facts, it is a tool for rebuilding legitimacy. Later rulers and elites often use the memory of disorder to define themselves as restorers. If the past contains a time of famine, rebellion, or divine withdrawal, then the present ruler can cast his reign as the return of justice, abundance, and proper hierarchy. Disorder becomes politically useful once it can be framed as what existed before rightful authority resumed. The more disturbing the remembered collapse, the more valuable it becomes as a contrast. A king who promises renewal does not need his people to remember the crisis precisely. He needs them to remember that life without strong order is frightening. Egypt offers one of the clearest versions of this process. The literary texts associated with social inversion and lament, though often composed later and filtered through elite concerns, linger on themes of overturned status, hunger, instability, and a world behaving against its own principles. The poor are elevated, the rich are displaced, moral order bends, and the familiar structure of Egyptian life seems to dissolve. Such writings cannot be read as simple windows onto one exact historical moment. Scholars still debate their dating, purpose, and relationship to the first intermediate period, but their importance is unmistakable. They preserve an Egyptian imagination in which political breakdown is remembered as a violation not merely of governance, but of the natural and moral fabric of existence. That tells us something profound about how deeply the experience of weakened order sank into the cultural mind. A lesser-known but especially revealing feature of post-collapse memory is the role of local self-presentation. Provincial rulers and later regional elites often describe themselves as providers in time of distress. Their inscriptions emphasize feeding the hungry, maintaining irrigation, protecting the vulnerable, or sustaining their districts when wider authority had failed. These claims are self-serving, certainly, but they reveal what audiences cared about. To be legitimate after collapse was not only to be noble or well-born, it was to have kept people alive. In this way, memory preserves practical morality. It honors not just kingship in the abstract, but competence under pressure. There is also a quieter kind of memory written into landscapes themselves. A ruined canal, an abandoned neighborhood, a repurposed building, a cemetery used differently from before. These are forms of remembrance even when no one writes them down. Children grow up among the remains of a larger world. They hear older people refer to places that once mattered more, routes that once carried more traffic, fields that once gave more grain. The land becomes layered with comparison. What exists now is measured against what stood before. This kind of memory is local, fragile, and often lost to historians. But it may have been the most powerful of all. A monument can outlast a famine. A half-empty settlement can outlast a dynasty. The survivors live with both. What survives in the record suggests that this period of contraction does not erase the desire for order. It intensifies it. Once people have experienced the failure of the large systems, the return of predictable rule becomes more precious, though perhaps also more conditional. Rulers who emerge after crisis must do more than declare themselves chosen. They must persuade people that the roads will be safer, the grain more dependable, the canals better maintained, the tax demands more survivable. In practice, of course, states often promise more than they deliver, but the memory of disorder changes the terms of political imagination. Stability is no longer just a background fact, it is something visibly lost and therefore consciously desired. This is one reason the age after collapse so often produces narratives of renewal. In Mesopotamia, later political traditions repeatedly frame successful rule as the restoration of balance after fragmentation. In Egypt, reunification under later dynasties acquires moral as well as political meaning. The ruler is not simply another contestant in the old game of power. He becomes the answer to remembered disarray. Memory thus turns historical suffering into ideological capital. It also distorts the past, compressing years or generations of complex local adaptation into a simpler opposition between chaos and order. That simplification is politically useful, but it can hide the reality that many people survived not because kings restored them quickly, but because communities endured on their own while the great powers struggled. There is a melancholy in that distortion. The small worlds built during the Age of Contraction often vanish behind the triumphant stories of later centralized regimes. History written by restored states prefers to remember breakdown as a dark interval awaiting salvation, not as a period in which ordinary people learned new forms of survival. Yet the evidence remains: villages, local elites, regional networks, altered farming strategies, and improvised authorities all contribute to the possibility of later recovery. The memory of collapse may belong to rulers, but the substance of survival belongs to everyone else. Scholars still debate how directly later literary memories can be tied to the exact events of the late Third Millennium crisis, and caution is necessary. Texts are shaped by later concerns, genres, and political needs. They may compress different episodes of hardship into one evocative image. They may exaggerate moral inversion for rhetorical effect. They may project later anxieties backward. Even so, they matter because they show that collapse leaves a cultural scar. Whatever the precise timeline, later societies in both Egypt and Mesopotamia remember that old orders can fail, that abundance can thin, and that political power is more fragile than monuments suggest. That memory becomes part of a legacy. It enters the instincts of later governance, the rhetoric of kingship, the way scribes describe rightful rule, the way local elites defend their worth, and the way entire civilizations narrate the distance between order and chaos. A world that has once seen its roads grow dangerous and its fields uncertain no longer treats stability as an unquestioned gift. It becomes something to praise, fear losing, and claim to restore. In that way, the collapse around 2200 BC continues long after its immediate material effects have faded. It reshapes not only political geography, but historical consciousness. There is also the deeper philosophical legacy that later ages may not state openly, but seem to feel all the same. Human order, however majestic, is contingent. Stone can rise higher than any household will remember, yet the grain that feeds the stonemason remains vulnerable to the sky. Empires can boast of universal rule, yet still be undone by thinning rivers, restless margins, and the unwillingness of exhausted farmers to bear one burden more. The stories later peoples tell about collapse are therefore also stories about limits. The gods may appear in those stories, but beneath them stands a clear human recognition. There is no political form so glorious that it escapes dependence on water, soil, labour, and time. As memory hardens into tradition, the ancient world prepares to move on. New kingdoms will rise. Old territories will be stitched together in different ways. Rulers will once again speak the language of permanence, as rulers always do. But permanence now carries an echo. Somewhere behind the renewed confidence lies the knowledge, however dim or stylized, that worlds have failed before. And that knowledge is the true legacy of 2200 BC. The collapse does not survive merely in ruins or texts. It survives in the warning built into later civilization itself that prosperity can be real and still fragile, that order can be brilliant and still temporary, and that what is rebuilt after disaster always contains the memory of what disaster made possible. What remains? After the ruins, the arguments, the drought signals, the fallen dynasties, and the migrating survivors is an ancient warning still standing. It does not stand in one place only. It stands in the dust that settled over abandoned ground in northern Mesopotamia. It stands in the memory of Akkad's broken greatness. It stands in the weakened Nile floods that seem to pass silently beneath the immense confidence of Old Kingdom stone. It stands in the altered cities of the Indus world, in the shrinking of long roads, in the local rulers who fed their districts while larger systems failed above them. Around 2200 BC, the ancient world reveals something both obvious and endlessly difficult for powerful societies to accept. Complexity is not the same thing as security. At the height of their confidence, these civilizations must have seemed nearly immovable. They controlled rivers, or believed they did. They built monuments that made human ambition look geological. They counted grain, taxed labor, extended trade over startling distances, and wrapped authority in cosmic language. From within such worlds, fragility is hard to imagine. Every successful season confirms the system. Every monument implies permanence. Every record reinforces the belief that what has been organized can continue being organized indefinitely. Yet the crisis of this age shows how narrow that confidence may have been. The systems worked brilliantly, but only within certain environmental and social limits. Once those limits were pressed from several directions at once, greatness became a burden as much as a strength. This is the deeper lesson of interconnected fragility. Early civilizations did not fail because they were primitive. They failed because they had become sophisticated enough to depend on many moving parts staying aligned. Rivers had to behave. Rainfall had to remain near known ranges. Roads had to stay open. Frontier pressure had to remain manageable. Farmers had to continue producing enough surplus to support elites, temples, soldiers, scribes, and labor projects. Administrations had to remain capable of extracting resources without exhausting the people who produced them. Political legitimacy had to survive visible hardship. None of these conditions was impossible on its own. Together they created a world of immense achievement. Together they also created the possibility of cascading failure. That is why the collapse around 2200 BC continues to matter. It is not simply an old disaster belonging to lost empires and half-buried cities. It is a case study in how human systems respond when environmental stress meets political overreach and social dependency. Scholars still debate the proportions. Some place more weight on drought, others on political fragmentation, migration, internal administrative weakness, or regional ecological differences. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every local history. But the broad picture is clear enough to hold. When pressure falls across many supports at once, even a sophisticated civilization can lose its balance very quickly. One of the most striking features of this warning is that collapse did not require total destruction. No giant fire had to erase the whole map. No universal conqueror had to sweep everything away. In many places, the older world simply became harder to maintain than to abandon, harder to believe in than to localize, harder to feed than to fragment. This is a more unsettling kind of collapse than dramatic apocalypse, because it arrives through ordinary breakdown, maintenance falters, harvests weaken, trust thins, migration increases, violence rises in cost and falls in effectiveness. Administrators continue speaking the language of control, while control is already narrowing. The civilization remains visible even as the system underneath it is giving way. By the time the silence becomes obvious, much of the real damage has already been done. A lesser-known but essential part of the warning lies in how survivors adapt. The ancient world does not end. It shrinks, regionalizes, and relearns its dependence on practical limits. Smaller worlds emerge because smaller worlds are what the land can still support. This matters because it reminds us that collapse is not merely failure, it is also enforced honesty. The crisis strips away inflated claims and leaves behind whatever can actually endure: local water, local authority, local grain, local memory. The people who survive are often not the ones best at speaking the language of grandeur, but the ones best at adjusting scale. There is also a moral lesson, though not a simple one. Ancient societies often remembered these events by blaming divine displeasure, outsiders, or the inversion of proper order. Modern observers may prefer drought curves, settlement maps, and systems theory. Both approaches, in their own way, are trying to answer the same human need: how could something so impressive fail? The most honest answer is also the least comforting. It failed because no society, however monumental, escapes dependence on the natural and human foundations beneath its display. A king may claim to rule the 4 quarters of the world, but he still depends on whether the grain ripens. A temple may stand for centuries, but it still depends on farmers, transport, and trust. A civilization may appear eternal in stone while remaining seasonal in everything that truly sustains it. This is why the 2200 BC collapse feels strangely modern despite its immense distance. Not because the ancient world was the same as ours, but because the structure of vulnerability is recognizable. The more connected a system becomes, the more strength it can gather and the more paths it creates for trouble to spread. The more successful it is at organizing life around predictable flows, the more dangerous unpredictability becomes. The more thoroughly a society builds itself around confidence, the more destabilizing it is when confidence fails. Ancient people understood this in lived experience, if not in analytical vocabulary. Their fields, archives, roads, and ruined cities still say it plainly. And still the warning is not one of despair. The ancient world after 2200 BC does not become empty. It becomes humbler. New kingdoms rise later. River valleys are cultivated again. Cities reappear or recover. Administrative traditions return in new forms. Human beings do what they always do. They rebuild on top of pain, often forgetting just enough to attempt greatness once more. But the warning remains in the layers below. Every later restoration stands over a previous failure. Every renewed claim to permanence is shadowed by the memory that permanence has failed before. To look at this period, then, is to see civilization stripped of its favourite illusion. The illusion is not that order exists. Order does exist, and the ancient world achieved it magnificently. The illusion is that order, once achieved, ceases to depend on conditions. Around 2200 BC, those conditions changed, and one of the first great global age systems of civilization discovered how quickly majesty can narrow into survival. What remains in the archaeological record is not only evidence of loss, it is evidence of truth. Civilizations are not monuments alone. They are agreements with rivers, soils, skies, labour, and memory. Break enough of those agreements, and even the grandest world becomes difficult to hold. That may be the oldest lesson still standing in the ruins of this age. The ancient world did not collapse because it lacked intelligence, courage, labour, or vision. It collapsed because all of those qualities were still not enough to command a changing environment and an overstrained human system forever. The warning is ancient, but it never really grows old. Power can accumulate, wealth can centralize, roads can lengthen, kings can call themselves universal. Yet somewhere beneath every age of confidence, the same quiet question waits: what happens if the conditions holding all this together begin, slowly, to fail? The people of 2200 BC did not know they were becoming a lesson. They only knew that the fields were less generous, the roads less safe, the rulers less convincing, and the future less familiar than the past. But from the distance of millennia, their world leaves behind a final image clear enough to understand. A civilization can stand at the height of its power and already be closer to fracture than it imagines. And when fracture comes, it is rarely the end of humanity. It is the end of certainty. The night settles again over riverbanks, abandoned quarters, and fields that have been planted and replanted by people whose names no longer remain. The monuments still catch the last light. The broken walls still hold a little warmth from the day. Somewhere beyond them lies dust over old roads, silence in rooms once counted and sealed, and a darkness moving gently across canals that no longer carry the weight of an empire. It is easy, from so far away, to imagine collapse as a single terrible moment, but the ancient world teaches something softer, sadder, and perhaps more lasting. Worlds do not always end in thunder. Sometimes they end in thinning harvests, in fewer footsteps on familiar paths, in a storehouse that sounds too hollow, in a village deciding not to rebuild one more wall. And still the land remembers more than the rulers do. Rivers continue in altered rhythms. Wind crosses the same plains where caravans once moved. New communities rise beside the bones of older ones. Children are born into smaller worlds and learn them as if they were all the world has ever been. That may be the quiet mercy hidden inside this history. Even after systems fail, morning comes. Bread is still made where grain can be found. Hands still work mud into bricks. Names are still given. Songs are still carried into sleep. The grandeur fades, but life persists in humbler forms, stubborn and close to the earth. Perhaps that is why the collapse of 2200 BC lingers so deeply in the imagination. It is not only the story of vanished certainty, it is also the story of how temporary certainty always was. The kings believed they had secured permanence. The scribes wrote as if order could be accounted for and preserved. The monuments rose in straight lines against the sky. Yet beneath all of it lay water, soil, weather, labour, and trust, those quiet foundations that no inscription can command forever. When they shifted, the world shifted with them. So the ancient cities sleep now under dust, under farms, under later ruins, under the patient work of archaeologists and the longer patience of time itself. But if one stands beside their remains in imagination, at the edge of evening, the lesson feels less like a warning shouted across history and more like a whisper. Be careful what you mistake for permanence. Be humble before what sustains you. Remember that every civilization, no matter how brilliant, lives by arrangements more fragile than it likes to admit. And then the light fades from the stones, the river goes dark, the fields become one wide shadow. Somewhere in that stillness is the memory of a world that once believed itself secure, and the softer memory of all the people who endured after that belief was gone, their cities changed, their kingdoms fractured, their certainties thinned into survival. But the earth kept turning beneath them, and the sky, however ungenerous, eventually cleared enough for another dawn,